There is something deeply moving about the story of a man who refused to surrender. What drives a prince to fight battle after battle when his own father has fled the kingdom? Why would someone choose resistance when submission might have saved his life? In the early years of the 11th century, England stood as a land of ancient traditions and proud warrior culture. The Saxon people had built something remarkable on this island. They had created a kingdom where law and custom mattered. They had established churches and monasteries that preserved learning. They had developed a system of government that would influence the world for centuries to come. And in the year 1016, all of this hung in the balance. One man stood between the complete conquest of England and the preservation of Saxon independence. His name was Edmund, and history would remember him as Ironside. Welcome to this journey through one of the most dramatic periods in English history. We're going to spend our time together exploring the complete story of Edmund Ironside, a warrior king whose reign lasted barely 7 months, but whose courage became legendary. This is a tale of invasion and resistance, of family betrayal and personal honour, of battles fought in muddy fields and political negotiations conducted on small islands in English rivers. It is the story of how one man's determination shaped the destiny of a nation, even though that man would not live to see the full consequences of his actions. Saxon England in the late 10th century was not the primitive backwater that later Norman propaganda would suggest. It was a sophisticated kingdom with a complex administrative system. The country was divided into shires, each governed by an ealdorman who answered to the king. These shires were further divided into hundreds, smaller units that handled local justice and military obligations. Every free man owed service to his lord, and ultimately to the king. This system of mutual obligation bound society together in ways that were remarkably effective for the time. The Saxon Church played a central role in daily life. Monasteries dotted the landscape, serving as centres of learning, agriculture and charity. The Great Abbey at Glastonbury claimed connections to the earliest days of Christianity in Britain. Winchester housed the bones of saints and the treasury of kings. Canterbury stood as the spiritual heart of the English Church, its archbishop second only to the king in influence and prestige. These religious institutions provided education for the sons of nobles, care for the sick and poor, and a framework of moral authority that helped maintain social order. The economy of Saxon England was more developed than many people realise. Towns had grown up around old Roman sites and at important crossroads. London was already a major trading centre, its wharves receiving goods from across Europe and beyond. York in the north maintained connections to Scandinavian trade routes. Smaller towns held weekly markets where farmers sold their produce and craftsmen offered their wares. A system of coinage, carefully controlled by the crown, facilitated this commerce. The silver penny of Saxon England was respected throughout the trading world for its consistent weight and purity. Agriculture formed the foundation of this economy. The open field system organised farming in most of England. Villages worked strips of land scattered across large common fields, rotating crops to maintain soil fertility. Oxen pulled heavy ploughs through the clay soils of the Midlands. Sheep grazed on the chalk downs of the south. Pigs rooted through the ancient forests that still covered much of the land. The rhythm of the agricultural year shaped the lives of most English people, from ploughing in spring to harvest in autumn, to the slaughter of surplus livestock as winter approached. The military system of Saxon England combined ancient Germanic traditions with more recent developments. The feared, a general levy of free men, could be called up in times of emergency. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen who owned weapons and knew how to use them. They served for limited periods, typically during the summer months when campaigning was practical. Alongside this general levy Kings maintained smaller forces of professional warriors. These household troops, known as huscarls, formed the elite core of any Saxon army. They lived at the king's expense, trained constantly for war, and were expected to fight to the death in defence of their lord. The Great Hall stood at the centre of Saxon aristocratic life. Here the king or lord sat in his high seat, dispensing justice, receiving guests, and rewarding loyal followers. Poets sang of ancient heroes and recent victories. Mead and ale flowed freely on feast days. The bonds between lord and follower were cemented through gifts of gold, weapons, and land. This was a society that valued loyalty above almost everything else. A man who abandoned his lord in battle faced not just death but eternal shame. His name would be cursed by future generations. His family would bear the stain of his cowardice. Yet this apparently stable world faced a terrible threat. From across the North Sea came the dragon ships of the Vikings. These Scandinavian raiders had been attacking England for over 2 centuries by the time of Edmund's birth. The first recorded Viking raid struck the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, shocking the Christian world with its brutality. In the years that followed, Viking armies had conquered much of eastern and northern England, establishing their own kingdoms and settlements. Only the determined resistance of Ethelred the Great had preserved the independence of Wessex, the southern Saxon kingdom that would eventually unite all of England under its rule. Alfred's descendants had slowly pushed back the Viking presence. His son Edward and grandson Athelstan extended Saxon authority northward. By the middle of the 10th century, England was united under a single Saxon king for the first time. This achievement seemed secure. The Viking threat appeared to have passed into history. The Scandinavian settlers in eastern England, the area known as the Danelaw, had largely assimilated into Saxon society. They kept some of their customs and legal traditions, but they accepted the authority of the English crown. Peace and prosperity seemed assured. This peace was an illusion. Across the sea, Scandinavian society was changing. The small-scale raiding that had characterized earlier Viking activity was giving way to something far more dangerous. Powerful kings were emerging in Denmark and Norway, men with the resources and ambition to launch full-scale invasions rather than mere raids. These new Viking leaders did not want plunder. They wanted kingdoms, and England, wealthy and apparently weak, looked like an attractive target. The first signs of renewed danger appeared in the 980s. Viking fleets began appearing off the English coast with increasing frequency. At first these seemed like throwbacks to the old raiding days. Ships would appear, warriors would descend on a coastal town or monastery, grab what valuables they could carry, and disappear before any organised resistance could form. But the raids grew larger and more coordinated. By the 990s, it was clear that something more serious was developing. These were not random pirates seeking easy plunder. These were the advance forces of a coming invasion. Into this world of gathering storm clouds, Edmund was born. The exact year of his birth remains uncertain, with historians suggesting dates ranging from around 988 to 993. What we know for certain is that he was a son of King Ethelred, the ruler of England during this time of crisis. Edmund grew up in a court shadowed by fear and failure, watching as his father struggled unsuccessfully to meet the Viking threat. He came of age during the worst years of the invasion, years that would shape his character and determine his destiny. The England of Edmund's childhood was a land living in fear. Every spring brought anxiety about what the summer raiding season might bring. Coastal communities learned to watch the horizon for the square sails of Viking ships. Inland towns wondered if this would be the year the raiders pushed further up the rivers. The church prayed for deliverance from the fury of the Northmen. And the king, Edmund's father, seemed unable to provide the protection his people desperately needed. Understanding this context is essential for appreciating Edmund's later achievements. He was not simply a brave warrior who happened to live in interesting times. He was a product of crisis, shaped by the failures he witnessed in his youth and determined to chart a different course. Where his father chose negotiation and payment, Edmund would choose battle. Where Ethelred fled from danger, Edmund would stand and fight. The contrast between father and son would become one of the defining themes of this period in English history. As we continue this journey through Edmund's life, we will explore how these early experiences moulded his character. We will follow him from the halls of his father's court to the battlefields where he earned his famous nickname. We will examine the political complexities of his time, the personalities of the key figures who surrounded him, and the military campaigns that made his reputation. And we will consider what might have been had Edmund lived longer than his brief 7 months as king. The story of Edmund Ironside is ultimately a story about resistance against overwhelming odds. It asks us to consider what we value and what we are willing to fight for. It challenges us to think about leadership and courage, about the choices individuals make when their world is falling apart around them. These are not merely historical questions. They speak to something universal in human experience, something that makes Edmund's story relevant across the centuries that separate his time from ours. So let us begin properly. Let us go back to the origins of Edmund's family, to the ancient royal House of Wessex that had ruled southern England for generations. Let us understand where Edmund came from before we can fully appreciate what he became. The House of Wessex had produced some of the greatest kings in English history. It had also produced some notable failures. Edmund would prove himself worthy of the best traditions of his family, even as he struggled against the consequences of his father's worst mistakes. The fire crackles gently as we settle into this tale. Outside, perhaps, the wind carries echoes of those long ago times when dragon ships prowled the coasts and warriors clashed in muddy fields. Inside, we have the luxury of distance, the ability to see patterns and meanings that the participants themselves could never have grasped. We know how the story ends, but they did not. For Edmund and his contemporaries, each day brought new uncertainties, new dangers, new decisions that had to be made without the benefit of hindsight. This is the world we are entering together, a world of courage and cowardice, of loyalty and betrayal, of desperate battles and doomed last stands. It is a world that produced one of the most remarkable figures in English history, a man whose brief reign left an indelible mark on the national memory. Edmund Ironside awaits us, and his story is ready to be told. The blood that flowed through Edmund's veins connected him to centuries of English history. His family, the royal House of Wessex, had risen from obscurity to dominate the entire island of Britain. Understanding this lineage is not merely an exercise in genealogy. It illuminates the expectations placed upon Edmund from birth and the traditions he would both honour and transform. The House of Wessex was not simply a family. It was an institution, a symbol of English identity, and a repository of national memory. The origins of the Wessex dynasty disappear into the mists of early medieval legend. Later genealogists traced the family back to the god Woden himself, a claim that reflected both the prestige of the royal house and the blending of pagan and Christian traditions in early English culture. More reliable history begins with Cerdic, who supposedly led a band of Saxon warriors to the shores of Hampshire sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century. Whether Cerdic was a real historical figure or a legendary founder invented to give the dynasty ancient roots remains debated by scholars. What matters is that by the 7th century, the kings of Wessex were established rulers of a substantial territory in southern England. For several centuries, Wessex was merely one of several competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, and East Anglia in the east all vied for supremacy at various times. The political map of England shifted constantly as kingdoms rose and fell, as strong kings expanded their territories and weak ones lost them. Wessex had periods of dominance and periods of subordination. Its kings sometimes ruled as overlords of other kingdoms and sometimes paid tribute to more powerful neighbours. This was the fluid, competitive world of early medieval English politics. Everything changed with the Viking invasions of the 9th century. The great Danish armies that descended on England in the 860s and 870s swept away the old order. Northumbria fell. East Anglia fell. Mercia was reduced to a rump state dependent on Wessex for survival. Only Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred, managed to resist successfully. This resistance transformed Wessex from one kingdom among several into the last bastion of English independence, and eventually the nucleus around which a united England would form. Alfred the Great, Edmund's ancestor, 6 generations back, became the pivotal figure in English history. When he came to the throne in 871, the situation seemed hopeless. Viking armies controlled most of England. Even Wessex had been invaded, forcing Alfred to flee into the marshes of Somerset with only a small band of followers. From this low point, Alfred rebuilt. He gathered forces, won a crucial victory at Edington in 878, and negotiated a peace that gave him time to prepare for future conflicts. He reorganised the military system of Wessex, building a network of fortified towns called burhs that could resist Viking attacks. He created a navy to challenge Viking control of the seas. He reformed the administration of his kingdom and promoted learning and literacy. Alfred did not live to see England united, but he laid the foundations for that achievement. His son Edward the Elder and his daughter Ethelflaed, the famous lady of the Mercians, continued the reconquest of Danish-held territory. Edward's son Athelstan completed the process, conquering the last Viking kingdom of York in 927 and becoming the first king to rule all of England. Athelstan styled himself King of the English, a title that reflected the new political reality he had created. The small kingdom of Wessex had become the Kingdom of England. The generations that followed Athelstan consolidated this achievement. Edmund I, Athelstan's half-brother, and Edmund Ironside's great-great-great-grandfather maintained English unity against renewed Viking pressure. His sons Edwig and Edgar ruled in turn, with Edgar's reign representing a high point of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Edgar the Peaceful, as he became known, presided over a prosperous and well-governed kingdom. He reformed the church, standardized coinage, and maintained peace with his neighbours. His coronation at Bath in 973, delayed until he was 30 years old, to emphasise his maturity and fitness to rule, became the model for all subsequent English coronations. Edgar's death in 975 began a period of instability that would have profound consequences for Edmund Ironside's life. Edgar left 2 sons by different mothers, and the succession was disputed. The elder son, Edward, was supported by the church and eventually became king, but he faced opposition from supporters of his younger half-brother Ethelred. This opposition turned deadly in 978 when Edward was murdered at Corfe Castle, almost certainly with the connivance of Ethelred's mother. The young Ethelred, probably only about 12 years old, became king amid suspicion and bloodshed. Ethelred is one of the most controversial figures in English history. His nickname, the Unready, is often misunderstood. It does not mean that he was unprepared, though he often was. The Old English word unrayed means poorly counselled or lacking in good counsel. The nickname is a pun on his name, which means noble counsel. Ethelred the Poorly Counselled was a king whose reign was marked by bad decisions, factional strife, and ultimate failure. He was also Edmund Ironside's father. The circumstances of Ethelred's accession cast a shadow over his entire reign. The murder of his half-brother Edward later venerated as a saint and martyr, left Ethelred with a tainted legitimacy that he never fully overcame. Those who had supported Edward remembered the crime and harboured resentment. Those who had supported Ethelred were implicated in murder and had to maintain their position through continued dominance at court. The result was a kingdom divided by faction and suspicion, poorly positioned to meet the external threats that would soon emerge. Ethelred married twice, and both marriages produced sons who would play important roles in the coming crisis. His first wife, Elfgifu of York, gave him several sons, including Athelstan, Ecgbert, Edmund, Eadred, Eadwig, and Edgar. Edmund, our subject, was probably the third or fourth son from this marriage, meaning that he was not originally expected to inherit the throne. Several older brothers stood between him and the crown, a situation that would change dramatically as the Viking invasions took their toll. Ethelred's second marriage, to Emma of Normandy in 1002, introduced new complications. Emma was the daughter of the Duke of Normandy, and the marriage was intended to prevent the Normans from providing bases and support for Viking raiders. It was a diplomatic marriage designed to address a strategic problem, but it created a new one. Emma bore Ethelred two sons, Alfred and Edward, who would later be known as Edward the Confessor. These half-brothers represented a potential rival line to the sons of the first marriage. The dynamics between the two sets of brothers would shape English politics for decades. Edmund grew up in this complicated family situation. He was a prince of the blood, a member of the most prestigious family in England, but he was not the heir apparent. His older brothers seemed destined for greater things. His father's second marriage had produced rivals with powerful Norman connections, and all around him the kingdom was falling apart under the pressure of Viking attacks. It was not an easy childhood, and it did not produce an easy man. The royal court where Edmund spent his early years was a place of both splendour and anxiety. The king moved constantly between royal estates, never staying long in one place. This peripatetic lifestyle served both practical and political purposes. It allowed the king to consume the food renders owed by different estates, spreading the burden of supporting the royal household across the kingdom. It also allowed the king to show himself to his people, to dispense justice, and to maintain personal connections with local leaders. For a young prince like Edmund, this constant movement meant exposure to all parts of the kingdom and all levels of society. The education of a Saxon prince combined practical and intellectual elements. Edmund would have learned to ride and fight from an early age. Skill with weapons was essential for any nobleman, and doubly so for a prince who might one day lead armies in battle. Hunting provided both training for war and entertainment, teaching young men to track prey, work in groups, and make quick decisions under pressure. These skills would serve Edmund well in the campaigns that lay ahead. But a prince also needed learning of a different kind. The church provided education for royal children, teaching them to read and write in both Latin and Old English. Edmund would have studied scripture and the writings of the church fathers. He would have learned something of history, both sacred and secular. The example of his ancestor Alfred, who had promoted learning and personally translated important texts into English, set a standard for royal intellectual engagement. Whether Edmund matched Alfred's scholarly interests, we cannot say, but he certainly received the education appropriate to his rank. The household of a Saxon king was a complex organisation with many specialised roles. The king's thegns served as his personal attendants and warriors. Priests and chaplains tended to spiritual needs and handled correspondence. Reeves and stewards managed royal estates and collected revenues. All of these people formed the immediate environment in which Edmund grew up. He would have known many of them personally, would have learned from their examples, and would have formed the relationships that would later support him in his struggles. Among the most important figures in any royal household were the ealdormen, the great nobles who governed the shires on the king's behalf. These men wielded enormous power in their territories. They led local military forces, presided over courts, and collected royal revenues. Their loyalty was essential to the functioning of the kingdom, and their disloyalty could be catastrophic. Edmund would have encountered these powerful figures at court, and would have had to learn how to navigate the complex politics of their rivalries and ambitions. One ealdorman in particular would play a crucial role in Edmund's story. Edric Streona, whose nickname means the grasper or the acquisitor, rose to prominence in the early years of the 11th century. He became ealdorman of Mercia, the largest and most important of the English earldoms. He also became one of Ethelred's most trusted advisors, a position he used to accumulate wealth and power. Edric was a skilled political operator, but his reputation for treachery would become legendary. His relationship with Edmund would be marked by suspicion, conflict, and ultimately betrayal. The royal lineage that Edmund inherited carried both privileges and burdens. As a descendant of Ethelred the Great, he was heir to a tradition of resistance against Viking aggression. The memory of Alfred's struggles and ultimate triumph remained alive in the 10th and 11th centuries. Chronicles and poems celebrated his achievements. His translations and law codes remained in use. The dynasty he had founded drew legitimacy from his accomplishments. For Edmund, this heritage was both an inspiration and a standard against which he would be measured. But the more recent history of the dynasty was less inspiring. The murder of Edward the Martyr had stained the family's reputation. Ethelred's failures against the Vikings were becoming increasingly apparent. The unity and prosperity of Edgar's reign seemed like a distant memory as the kingdom fractured under pressure. Edmund inherited not just the glory of Alfred, but also the problems created by his father's inadequate response to crisis. The House of Wessex had survived previous challenges. It had overcome Viking invasions, succession disputes, and periods of weakness. The question that hung over Edmund's generation was whether it could survive the current crisis. The Vikings, who now threatened England, were not disorganized raiders but the subjects of powerful Scandinavian kings. The resources they could bring to bear dwarfed anything England had faced before, and the English kingdom, weakened by internal divisions and poor leadership, seemed ill-equipped to resist. Edmund's position in the succession changed as the crisis deepened. His older brothers died one by one, leaving him increasingly prominent among the surviving sons of Ethelred's first marriage. The details of these deaths are largely lost to history. Some may have died in battle against the Vikings. Others may have succumbed to disease or accident. Whatever the causes, by the time Edmund emerged as a significant political figure in his own right, he had become one of the leading candidates to succeed his father. This rise in prominence brought both opportunities and dangers. Edmund could now hope to become king, but he also became a target for those who preferred other candidates. The sons of Emma of Normandy, though younger, had powerful supporters. Various nobles had their own preferences based on factional alignments and personal interests. The succession to the English throne was not automatic or uncontested. It required the support of the great men of the kingdom, and that support had to be earned or won. The traditions of the House of Wessex emphasised certain qualities in a king. He should be a warrior, capable of leading his people in battle. He should be generous, rewarding loyal followers with gifts and lands. He should be just, upholding the law and protecting the weak from the strong. He should be pious, supporting the church and living according to Christian principles. And he should be wise, taking good counsel and making sound decisions. These were the standards against which Edmund would be judged, and these were the qualities he would need to demonstrate if he hoped to claim his inheritance. As we leave this exploration of Edmund's lineage and turn to his childhood experiences, we carry with us an understanding of what it meant to be a Prince of Wessex in the early 11th century. It meant belonging to a family with a glorious past and an uncertain future. It meant growing up in the shadow of both Alfred's achievements and Ethelred's failures. It meant preparing for a role that might never come or might come sooner than expected. And it meant watching as the kingdom built by generations of ancestors faced its greatest test since Alfred's desperate stand in the marshes of Somerset. The blood of kings flowed through Edmund's veins, but blood alone would not save England. That would require courage, determination, and skill at arms. It would require the ability to inspire men to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. It would require the iron will that would earn Edmund his famous nickname. These qualities were not inherited. They were forged in the fires of experience, shaped by the challenges of a childhood lived in the shadow of invasion and failure. The world Edmund knew as a child was a world at war. From his earliest memories, the threat of Viking invasion would have coloured everything. The conversations of adults, the movements of the court, the prayers of the church all reflected the constant danger that hung over England. For a prince of the royal house, this was not an abstract concern. It was personal, immediate, and inescapable. The Vikings were not just attacking England. They were attacking his family's kingdom, his inheritance, his future. The first major Viking attack of Ethelred's reign came in 980, probably before Edmund was born. A fleet struck Southampton, killing most of the inhabitants and carrying off plunder. In the same year, raiders attacked Thanet in Kent and ravaged Cheshire in the northwest. These attacks announced the end of the relative peace that had prevailed since Edgar's reign. The Vikings had returned, and they would not be easily driven away. The pattern of these early raids followed familiar lines. Viking fleets would appear off the coast, usually in spring or summer when sailing conditions were favourable. They would strike quickly, overwhelming local defences before any organised response could be mounted. They would seize whatever valuables they could find, take captives to sell as slaves, and then withdraw before the king could bring his army to bear. By the time royal forces arrived, the raiders were gone, leaving only smoking ruins and grieving survivors. Ethelred's government struggled to respond effectively. The old defensive system created by Alfred, the network of boors or fortified towns, had been allowed to decay. Many of the boors had lost their military character, becoming ordinary market towns without adequate walls or garrisons. The fyrd, the general military levy, was slow to assemble and difficult to keep in the field for extended periods. And the Vikings had learned to exploit these weaknesses, striking where defences were weak and withdrawing before the English could concentrate their forces. The situation worsened dramatically in 991. A large Viking fleet under the command of Olaf Tryggvason, a Norwegian prince who would later become King of Norway, attacked southeastern England. The English response was led by Byrhtnoth, the Ealdorman of Essex, an elderly but still vigorous warrior who represented the best traditions of Saxon nobility. Byrhtnoth gathered the local fyrd and confronted the Vikings at Malden in Essex, where a tidal causeway connected the mainland to an island where the Vikings had camped. The Battle of Malden became one of the most famous events in Anglo-Saxon history, commemorated in a poem that survives to this day. Byrhtnoth, in a gesture of aristocratic honour that proved militarily disastrous, allowed the Vikings to cross the causeway and form up for battle on the mainland. The resulting fight was fierce but ultimately one-sided. Byrhtnoth was killed, and the English army was destroyed. The poem celebrates the loyalty of those who died with their lord, fighting to the last even when the battle was clearly lost. It also implicitly criticises those who fled, abandoning their duty and their honour. The defeat at Malden had consequences far beyond the immediate military situation. It demonstrated that the Vikings could defeat English armies in open battle. It removed one of the kingdom's most capable military leaders, and it led directly to a fateful decision that would shape the rest of Ethelred's reign. Rather than continue fighting, the king and his council chose to buy off the Vikings with tribute. This tribute, known as Darngeld, became a defining feature of Ethelred's reign. The payment in 991 was £10,000 of silver, an enormous sum that had to be raised through special taxation. The Vikings accepted the money and departed, but they had learned an important lesson. England would pay to avoid fighting. This knowledge guaranteed that they would return, demanding ever larger payments. The Danegeld of 991 was just the beginning. Subsequent payments in 994, 1002, 1007, and 1012 would total tens of thousands of pounds, draining the kingdom's wealth and demonstrating its weakness. Edmund grew up watching this policy of appeasement fail repeatedly. Each payment brought only temporary relief. Each time the Vikings returned, they demanded more. The logic was inexorable. Why would the Vikings stop raiding when raiding was so profitable? Why would they accept a one-time payment when they could return year after year for more? The Darngeld did not buy peace. It bought time, and not very much time at that. The impact of these payments on English society was profound. The silver had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was the pockets of everyone, from great lords to humble peasants. Special taxes were levied to raise the necessary funds. Church treasures were melted down. The economy was distorted by the constant drain of precious metal out of the country, and the psychological effect was perhaps even worse than the economic one. The English were paying their enemies to go away, an admission of weakness that corroded national morale. For a young prince like Edmund, these years must have been formative in the most troubling way. He watched his father pursue a policy that clearly was not working. He saw the kingdom's resources squandered on tribute that brought only brief respites. He witnessed the frustration and anger of warriors who wanted to fight, but were instead ordered to collect taxes for payments to the enemy. The lessons of his childhood were lessons in failure, in the consequences of weakness, in the price of choosing the easy path over the hard one. The court politics of these years were equally troubled. Ethelred's government was riven by faction and suspicion. The king seemed unable to trust anyone for long. Advisers rose and fell with bewildering speed. Accusations of treachery, some justified and some not, poisoned relationships at the highest levels. The murder of Edward the Martyr at the beginning of the reign had set a tone of violence and distrust that persisted throughout. One particularly dark episode occurred in 1002. Ethelred ordered a massacre of Danes living in England, an event known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. The extent and nature of this massacre remain debated by historians. It may have targeted only Danish mercenaries in royal service, or it may have been a broader attack on Danish settlers. What is clear is that it was both morally reprehensible and strategically foolish. Among those killed was Gunhildi, the sister of Svein Forkbeard, the king of Denmark. This gave Svein a personal grievance to add to his political ambitions, ensuring that future Viking attacks would be driven by vengeance as well as greed. Edmund would have been a child or young adolescent at the time of the St. Brice's Day massacre. We do not know what he thought of this event, or whether he was even aware of its full implications at the time. But as he grew older and came to understand the political situation more fully, he must have recognized it as one of his father's many mistakes. The massacre did not weaken the Danish threat. It intensified it, giving the enemy additional motivation for their attacks. The years following 1-2 brought escalating violence. Svein Forkbeard launched major expeditions against England in 1003, 1004, and subsequent years. These were not mere raids, but campaigns of conquest and destruction. Svein's armies burned towns, devastated the countryside, and defeated English forces in battle after battle. The Darngeld payments continued, growing ever larger, but they no longer even bought a temporary peace. The Vikings took the money and kept fighting. Exeter fell to the Vikings in 1003. Norwich was burned in 1004. A great famine in 1005 provided brief relief, as even the Vikings could not campaign effectively when there was no food to be had. But they returned in 1006, ravaging much of southern England and establishing a base on the Isle of Wight from which they could strike at will. The payment that year was £36,000, a staggering sum that represented the accumulated wealth of generations. Through all of this, Edmund was growing toward manhood. He was learning to fight, to ride, to lead men. He was also learning through bitter observation what not to do as a king. His father's policies were failing catastrophically. The kingdom was being bled dry financially and devastated physically. The morale of the English people was collapsing under the weight of repeated defeats and endless payments to the enemy. Something had to change, but Ethelred seemed incapable of changing it. The relationship between Edmund and his father during these years is largely hidden from us. The sources do not record their private conversations or personal feelings, but we can infer something from later events. Edmund would eventually break openly with his father's policies, pursuing a strategy of active resistance rather than appeasement. This break did not happen overnight. It must have been the result of years of growing frustration, of watching failure pile upon failure, of concluding that his father's approach was not just unsuccessful, but fundamentally wrong. The household where Edmund grew up included his brothers and half-brothers, potential allies and potential rivals. The sons of Ethelred's first marriage seem to have formed a relatively cohesive group, united by their mother and their position as the senior line. The sons of Emma of Normandy were younger and had different connections, particularly to the Norman duchy across the Channel. These family dynamics would become politically significant as the succession question grew more pressing. Edmund's mother, Elfgifu of York, is a shadowy figure in the sources. We know her name and her northern origins, but little else. She seems to have died sometime before Ethelred's second marriage in 1002, leaving her sons without their most natural advocate at court. The arrival of Emma and the birth of her sons created a new centre of power within the royal family, one that did not necessarily have the interests of Edmund and his brothers at heart. Education for a prince in this period combined book learning with practical skills. Edmund would have been taught to read, probably in both Latin and Old English. He would have studied the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers. The monasteries that served as centres of learning in Saxon England would have provided tutors for the royal children. These men of the Church brought not just literacy, but a broader worldview, connecting the young prince to the intellectual traditions of Christian Europe. The practical side of Edmund's education was equally important. A prince was expected to be a warrior, and training for war began early. Young boys learned to handle weapons almost as soon as they could walk. Wooden swords gave way to real blades as they grew older. The skills of combat were drilled through constant practice until they became instinctive. A warrior in battle had no time to think about technique. His responses had to be automatic, honed through years of repetition. Horsemanship was another essential skill. The Saxon nobility fought primarily on foot, unlike the later Norman knights who would conquer England in 1066. But horses were vital for transportation, for scouting, and for the pursuit of defeated enemies. A prince needed to ride well, to control his mount in difficult conditions, and to fight from horseback when necessary. The hunting that occupied so much of aristocratic leisure time served as training for these skills, teaching young men to ride hard across rough country while managing weapons and working with others. The bow was a weapon that every nobleman was expected to master. Hunting with bow and arrow developed the eye and the steady hand that would be needed in battle. The forests of England teemed with deer, boar, and other game that provided both sport and food for the royal household. Edmund would have spent many days in these forests, learning to track prey, to wait patiently for the right moment, and to strike accurately when that moment came. But perhaps the most important lessons Edmund learned were not about weapons or horsemanship. They were about leadership. A prince needed to understand how to command men, how to inspire loyalty, and how to make decisions under pressure. These skills could not be taught in a classroom. They had to be developed through experience, through watching others lead, and through gradually taking on responsibilities of one's own. The royal household provided many opportunities for such learning. Edmund would have observed his father dealing with the great men of the kingdom, dispensing justice and managing the complex politics of the court. He would have seen how different approaches produced different results. He would have noticed which nobles were trustworthy and which were not, which advisers gave good counsel, and which told the king only what he wanted to hear. These observations would shape his own leadership style when his time came. The religious dimension of Edmund's upbringing deserves attention. Saxon England was a deeply Christian society, and the royal family was expected to set an example of piety. The king was not just a secular ruler, but a figure with sacred responsibilities. He was anointed with holy oil at his coronation, set apart for his role by divine sanction. He was expected to protect the church, to promote Christian morality, and to ensure that justice was done throughout his realm. Edmund would have grown up surrounded by religious observance. The daily round of prayers, the celebration of feast days, the rituals of the church year all structured life at court. Priests and monks were constant presences, serving as chaplains, advisors, and teachers. The great cathedrals and monasteries of England were not distant institutions, but integral parts of the world Edmund knew. He would have visited many of them, witnessed their ceremonies, and understood their importance to the kingdom. The church also provided a framework for understanding the Viking threat. The raids were seen not just as political or military problems, but as divine punishment for the sins of the English people. Sermons and homilies emphasized this interpretation, calling for repentance and moral reform as the path to deliverance. Archbishop Wulfstan of York, one of the leading churchmen of the age, preached famous sermons denouncing the wickedness of the times and warning of worse to come if the people did not change their ways. This religious interpretation of events would have influenced how Edmund understood his situation. The Vikings were not just enemies to be fought. They were instruments of God's judgment, sent to chastise a sinful nation. Victory against them required not just military strength, but moral worthiness. A king who hoped to defeat the Vikings needed to be righteous himself, and to lead his people toward righteousness. This was a heavy burden for any ruler to bear, adding spiritual dimensions to the already daunting practical challenges. The physical environment of Edmund's childhood shifted constantly as the court moved from estate to estate. He would have known the great royal centres of Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, and London, the commercial heart of the kingdom. He would have stayed at countless smaller estates scattered across southern England, each with its own character and its own local significance. This constant movement gave him a knowledge of the kingdom that would prove valuable in later years, when he would need to raise armies and fight campaigns across this same landscape. Winchester held special importance for the royal family. It was the traditional seat of the West Saxon kings, the place where the royal treasury was kept, and where many kings were buried. The Old Minster, the great church at the heart of Winchester, housed the relics of saints and the tombs of Edmund's ancestors. Walking through its precincts, the young prince would have been surrounded by reminders of his heritage and his responsibilities. The bones of Ethelred the Great lay somewhere nearby, a constant reminder of what a king of Wessex could achieve. London was a different kind of place. It was a commercial city, bustling with trade and full of people from many lands. Viking merchants mingled with English traders in its markets. Ships from across Europe tied up at its wharves. The city had its own traditions and its own sense of identity, not entirely comfortable with royal authority. London would play a crucial role in the events to come, its walls providing refuge when other defences failed, and its citizens showing a stubborn determination to resist that matched Edmund's own. The great nobles of the kingdom would have been familiar figures to Edmund from childhood. Men like Ealdorman Elfric of Hampshire, Ealdorman Ulfketel of East Anglia, and the rising Edric Striona of Mercia were regular presences at court. Edmund would have learned their characters, their strengths and weaknesses, their loyalties and their ambitions. This knowledge would be essential when he later had to decide whom to trust and whom to suspect. Ulfketel of East Anglia deserves particular mention. He was one of the few English leaders who consistently showed willingness to fight the Vikings rather than pay them off. In 1004, when a Viking army under Swine Forkbeard attacked East Anglia, Ulfketel organised resistance and fought a hard battle that earned him respect even from his enemies. The Vikings called him Ulfketel Snilling, Ulfketel the Valiant, a nickname that reflected their recognition of his courage. For Edmund, watching from afar, Ulfketel must have represented an alternative to his father's failed policies, proof that resistance was possible even in desperate circumstances. The contrast with Edric Striona could not have been sharper. Edric rose to power through political manipulation rather than military prowess. He married one of Ethelred's daughters, cementing his position at court. He accumulated lands and offices, becoming the most powerful nobleman in England. But his methods were suspect. Accusations of treachery and murder followed him throughout his career. He was said to have arranged the killing of rival nobles, to have betrayed English armies to the Vikings, and to have switched sides whenever it seemed advantageous. Whether all these accusations were true, the fact that they were made so persistently suggests that Edric's reputation was well established. Edmund's relationship with Edric would become one of the defining conflicts of his career. The two men represented fundamentally different approaches to the crisis facing England. Edric favoured negotiation, accommodation, and political manoeuvring. Edmund favoured direct confrontation and military resistance. These differences would eventually lead to open conflict, with consequences that shaped the fate of the kingdom. As Edmund moved through his teenage years, the situation in England continued to deteriorate. The Viking attacks grew more intense and more destructive. The payments of Danegeld grew larger, but brought less relief. The English military repeatedly failed to bring the Vikings to battle or to defeat them when battle was joined. The kingdom seemed to be sliding toward collapse, and nothing Ethelred did could reverse the trend. The year 1009 brought a new phase in the crisis. A massive Viking fleet arrived, led by two formidable commanders named Thorkel the Tall and Hemming. This was not a raiding party, but an army of conquest, determined to extract maximum wealth from England and perhaps to seize the kingdom itself. For the next several years, this army would ravage England almost at will, defeating every force sent against it and demonstrating the complete inadequacy of English defences. Thorkel the Tall was a legendary figure among the Vikings. He was said to be of extraordinary height and strength, a warrior of almost superhuman prowess. He was also a leader of the Jomsvikings, a semi-legendary brotherhood of elite warriors based at a fortress somewhere on the Baltic coast. Whether the Jomsvikings were a real organisation or a later literary invention remains debated, but Thorkel himself was certainly real and certainly formidable. His presence in England raised the stakes of the conflict dramatically. The army of 1009 established itself in England and began systematic devastation. They moved through the country, burning towns, destroying crops, and defeating any English forces that dared to oppose them. The English response was chaotic and ineffective. Armies were raised but then dispersed without fighting. Defensive positions were prepared but then abandoned. The leadership failures, that had plagued Ethelred's reign reached their nadir during these terrible years. Edmund was now old enough to participate in these events, though his exact role remains unclear. He would have been in his late teens or early 20s, an age when Saxon princes were expected to take on military responsibilities. Whether he fought in any of the unsuccessful campaigns against Thorkel's army, we cannot say with certainty, but he was certainly watching, learning, and forming the judgments that would guide his later actions. The fall of Canterbury in 1011 marked a low point in the English resistance. Canterbury was the spiritual heart of the English Church, the seat of the Archbishop and the repository of centuries of religious tradition. Its capture by the Vikings was a shock that reverberated throughout Christendom. Archbishop Alfheir was taken prisoner and held for ransom. When the ransom was not paid, the Vikings murdered him in a drunken feast, pelting him with bones and ox heads until one of them finished him with an axe blow to the skull. The martyrdom of Archbishop Alfheir had profound effects on English morale. Here was a man of God, the highest religious authority in the land, killed by pagans while his king was unable to protect him. The symbolism was devastating. If the Archbishop was not safe, no one was safe. If Canterbury could fall, any place could fall. The failure of Ethelred's government could not have been more starkly demonstrated. Yet from this disaster came an unexpected development. Thorkel the Tall, the very commander who had led the army that captured Canterbury, switched sides. Whether he was genuinely horrified by the murder of the Archbishop or simply saw better opportunities in English service, he offered his warriors to Ethelred. The king accepted, adding 45 ships' worth of Viking mercenaries to his forces. It was a desperate measure, hiring the enemy to fight for you, but it reflected the desperate situation England faced. The presence of Thorkel's Vikings in English service added a new element to the military equation. These were experienced professional warriors, far more formidable than the feared levies that formed the bulk of English armies. They knew Viking tactics from the inside and could counter them effectively. Their presence gave the English a capability they had previously lacked, but it also created tensions as English warriors found themselves fighting alongside men who'd recently been burning their homes and killing their families. Edmund's opinion of this arrangement is not recorded, but we can make some inferences. He would later show a preference for fighting the Vikings rather than buying them off or hiring them. The policy of using Viking mercenaries, while pragmatically sensible, may have struck him as another form of the appeasement that had failed so consistently. Real victory required defeating the enemy, not paying them to change sides temporarily. The years of Edmund's youth were thus years of unrelenting crisis. He grew from childhood to manhood, watching his father fail, watching his kingdom suffer, watching everything his ancestors had built threatened with destruction. These experiences shaped him in ways we can only partially understand. They gave him a determination to fight that would define his brief reign. They taught him what not to do as a king, and they created in him a fierce desire to prove himself worthy of his lineage, to be the king his father had failed to be. As we move forward in Edmund's story, we carry with us an understanding of the world that made him. It was a world of fear and failure, of invasion and inadequate response, of great traditions under mortal threat. Edmund emerged from this world as a man of action, impatient with half measures and determined to confront the enemy directly. The iron in Ironside was forged in these years of childhood and youth, tempered by the fires of a kingdom under siege. The Vikings who threatened Edmund's England were not the disorganised raiders of earlier centuries. They were the subjects of powerful kings, organised into formidable armies and driven by ambitions that went far beyond simple plunder. Understanding who these enemies were and what they wanted is essential for appreciating the scale of the challenge Edmund would face. The Viking world of the early 11th century was a world of emerging states and ambitious rulers, and England was the greatest prize they sought. Scandinavia in this period was undergoing a transformation. The small chieftaincies and petty kingdoms of earlier times were consolidating into larger political units. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were emerging as distinct kingdoms, each with its own royal dynasty and its own ambitions. The process was violent and contested, with rival claimants fighting for supremacy and losers often seeking their fortunes abroad. England provided an outlet for these displaced warriors and a target for the ambitions of successful kings. Denmark was the most powerful and best organised of the Scandinavian kingdoms. Its position at the base of the Scandinavian peninsula gave it control over the vital trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea with the North Sea and the Atlantic beyond. Danish kings had been building their power for generations, constructing fortresses, organising armies, and extending their authority over previously independent regions. By the late 10th century, Denmark was a formidable state capable of projecting military power across the seas. The king who would prove most dangerous to Edmund's England was Sweyn Forkbeard. His nickname referred to his distinctive forked beard, a fashion that set him apart and made him instantly recognisable. Sweyn had come to power in Denmark around 986, reportedly after rebelling against his own father, Harold Bluetooth. The circumstances of this rebellion are murky, wrapped in later legend and propaganda, but the result was clear. Sweyn became king of Denmark and immediately began looking for ways to expand his power. Sweyn's interest in England was both personal and political. Politically, England represented wealth and prestige. Conquering it would make Sweyn one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, master of a wealthy kingdom with a sophisticated administration and extensive resources. Personally, Sweyn may have had grievances against the English crown. The St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, in which his sister Gunhilda was reportedly killed, gave him a motive of vengeance to add to his ambitions. The early raids that Sweyn launched or sponsored against England were tests of English defences and sources of plunder to fund further operations. Each successful raid demonstrated English weakness and encouraged more attacks. Each payment of Danegeld proved that the English would pay rather than fight, making future raids even more attractive. Sweyn was patient and methodical, building toward the final conquest through years of preliminary operations. The military forces that Sweyn and other Viking leaders commanded were among the most effective in Europe. Viking warriors were professionals in an age when most armies consisted of part-time soldiers. They trained constantly for war, maintained their weapons and equipment to high standards, and followed leaders who had proven themselves in battle. The bonds between a Viking chief and his followers were personal and intense, cemented by shared dangers and shared rewards. The longship was the technological foundation of Viking military power. These vessels were marvels of naval architecture, combining speed, seaworthiness, and shallow draught in ways that no other ships of the time could match. They could cross open oceans, navigate shallow rivers, and be hauled overland between waterways. A Viking fleet could appear almost anywhere, striking targets that seemed safely inland and withdrawing before defenders could respond. This mobility gave the Vikings a strategic advantage that English forces struggled to counter. Viking tactics on land were equally sophisticated. They understood the importance of fortification, building camps and strongholds that could serve as bases for extended operations. They used cavalry for scouting and pursuit, though they typically fought on foot in major battles. They were masters of the shield wall, the formation of interlocked shields that was the standard infantry tactic of the age, and they were utterly ruthless, using terror as a weapon to demoralize opponents and encourage submission. The religious dimension of Viking warfare added to its terror. Although many Vikings had converted to Christianity by this period, the memory of pagan raids was still fresh. Churches and monasteries, the repositories of wealth and learning, had been favourite targets of earlier Viking attacks. The murder of Archbishop Ælfhere in 1012 showed that even Christian Vikings could commit acts of shocking brutality against religious figures. For the English, fighting the Vikings was not just a political struggle, but a defence of Christian civilization against forces of darkness. Sweyn's campaigns against England escalated through the first decade of the 11th century. Each expedition was larger and more destructive than the last. Each demonstrated more clearly the inability of Ethelred's government to protect its people. The payments of Danegeld grew to staggering amounts, £36,000 in 1007 and £48,000 in 1012, sums that represented the accumulated wealth of generations. Yet the payments brought only brief respites, never lasting peace. The Great Invasion came in 1013. Sweyn arrived with a fleet and army larger than any he had previously brought to England. This was not a raid, but a campaign of conquest, intended to overthrow Ethelred and place Sweyn on the English throne. The Danish king landed in the north, at Sandwich, and then moved to the Humber, the great estuary that provided access to the heart of northern England. Sweyn's strategy was shrewd. He began in the areas of England with the strongest Scandinavian heritage, the old Danelaw where Danish settlers had lived for generations. These people shared language and culture with the invaders. Many of them had maintained connections to Scandinavia despite generations of living under English rule. They were natural allies for a Danish king seeking to conquer England, and Sweyn cultivated their support carefully. The submission of the north came quickly. The people of Northumbria accepted Sweyn as their king almost immediately. The 5 boroughs, the Danish towns of the East Midlands, followed suit. Sweyn had secured half of England almost without fighting, demonstrating the fragility of English unity and the depth of dissatisfaction with Ethelred's rule. The speed of these submissions showed how thoroughly Ethelred had lost the confidence of his people. From the north, Sweyn moved south. His army marched through the Midlands, receiving submissions as it went. Oxford surrendered. Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, surrendered. The heartland of the English kingdom was falling to the invader, with barely a blow struck in its defence. Ethelred's government seemed paralysed, unable to organise any effective resistance. London alone held out. The city's walls, maintained since Roman times, provided a strong defensive position. The citizens of London, perhaps more committed to the English cause than people elsewhere, refused to submit. Thorkel the Tall and his Viking mercenaries, still in English service, helped defend the city. Sweyn attacked but could not break through. London's resistance was a rare bright spot in an otherwise dismal picture. But London's defiance could not save Ethelred. With most of the kingdom in Sweyn's hands, the English king's position became untenable. Late in 1013, Ethelred fled to Normandy, seeking refuge with his wife, Emma's relatives. It was a humiliating end to a humiliating reign. The King of England had abandoned his kingdom, leaving his people to the mercy of a foreign conqueror. Edmund's whereabouts during these events are not entirely clear. He seems to have remained in England after his father's flight, perhaps in London or perhaps elsewhere. His refusal to flee with Ethelred may indicate an early divergence between father and son, a determination to stay and resist even when the king himself had given up. Or it may simply reflect the practical difficulties of organising a royal evacuation in the midst of crisis. Whatever the reason, Edmund's presence in England during Sweyn's conquest would prove significant. Sweyn Forkbeard was now King of England, the first Danish king to rule the entire country. His conquest had been remarkably swift and relatively bloodless, achieved more through political submission than military victory. The English had not been defeated in battle so much as they had lost the will to fight. Ethelred's failures had created a situation where conquest became almost inevitable, where resistance seemed pointless, where submission appeared the only rational choice. But Sweyn's triumph was brief. On February 3rd, 1014, just 5 weeks after completing his conquest, Sweyn died suddenly at Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. The cause of death is unknown. Later legends attributed it to divine intervention, claiming that Saint Edmund, the martyred king of East Anglia, killed by Vikings in 869, had appeared to Sweyn and struck him down. More prosaic explanations suggest illness or accident. Whatever the cause, Sweyn's death transformed the political situation overnight. The Danish army in England acclaimed Sweyn's son Cnut as their new king. Cnut was young, probably around 18 years old, but he had accompanied his father on the invasion and had proven himself capable. The Danish warriors were loyal to the dynasty and saw no reason to abandon their conquest just because the old king had died. They expected to continue ruling England under their new leader. But the English saw an opportunity. With Sweyn dead and his son untested, perhaps the conquest could be reversed. Messages were sent to Ethelred in Normandy, inviting him to return. The terms were significant. The English nobles would accept Ethelred back as king, but only if he promised to rule better than before, to address their grievances, and to govern with their counsel. It was a conditional restoration, reflecting how thoroughly Ethelred had lost the trust of his people. Ethelred accepted the terms and returned to England in the spring of 1014. His arrival put pressure on Cnut, who found his position suddenly precarious. The English submissions that had come so easily to Sweyn now began to unravel. Cnut lacked the resources and the established authority to maintain control against a resurgent English resistance. Faced with this deteriorating situation, he made a strategic decision to withdraw. Cnut's departure from England in 1014 was not a retreat, but a strategic redeployment. He took his fleet to Denmark, where he could consolidate his position, gather reinforcements, and prepare for a return. Before leaving, he committed an act of calculated brutality that would not be forgotten. He mutilated the hostages that English nobles had given to his father, cutting off their hands, ears, and noses before putting them ashore at Sandwich. This atrocity served notice that Cnut would return, and that those who had submitted to his father and then changed sides would face terrible consequences. The mutilation of the hostages was a message written in blood and suffering. It told the English that the war was not over, that Cnut considered himself the rightful king of England, and that he would punish those who defied him. It also created a legacy of hatred that would make future negotiations more difficult. The families of the mutilated hostages would never forget what Cnut had done. Their desire for vengeance would complicate any future settlement. Edmund emerges more clearly into the historical record during this period of Ethelred's restoration. He was now a grown man, probably in his mid-20s, and increasingly prominent among the king's sons. His older brothers had died, leaving him as the leading candidate to succeed among the children of Ethelred's first marriage. The half-brothers, Edward and Alfred, sons of Emma of Normandy, were still young children, not yet serious contenders for power. The relationship between Edmund and his father during this restored reign was troubled. Edmund seems to have disagreed fundamentally with how Ethelred was handling the ongoing crisis. The king fell back into his old patterns of indecision and faction fighting. He failed to use the respite provided by Cnut's withdrawal to strengthen English defences. He allowed himself to be manipulated by Edric Striona and other self-interested advisers. The opportunity presented by Sweyn's death was being squandered. Edmund's frustration boiled over in 1015. In that year, he took actions that amounted to open defiance of his father. He went to the 5 boroughs, the Danish towns of the East Midlands, and began building his own power base. He married Ealdgyth, the widow of a Danish thegn named Sigurferth, whom Edric Striona had recently murdered. This marriage was politically significant, connecting Edmund to the Danish population of the Midlands and positioning him as an alternative leader for those dissatisfied with Ethelred's rule. The murder of Sigurferth and his companion Morcar was one of Edric Streona's many dark deeds. These two men were prominent thegns of the Five Boroughs, leaders of the Anglo-Danish community of the East Midlands. Edric lured them to a meeting and had them killed, supposedly with Ethelred's approval. Their lands were confiscated and their families persecuted. It was a typical example of the treacherous politics that characterised Ethelred's court. Edmund's response was bold and defiant. He rescued Sigurferth's widow from the convent where Ethelred had confined her and married her against his father's explicit orders. He then went to the Five Boroughs and claimed the lands of the murdered thanes, presenting himself as a protector of the Anglo-Danish population against the persecution of Edric and Ethelred. It was a declaration of independence, a statement that Edmund would pursue his own policy regardless of his father's wishes. This break between Edmund and Ethelred reflected deeper disagreements about how to handle the Viking threat. Ethelred continued to rely on Edric Streona and to pursue policies of negotiation and payment. Edmund believed that only military resistance could save England. He was building an army and a following in preparation for the fight he knew was coming. When Cnut returned, Edmund intended to be ready. The summer of 1015 brought the expected invasion. Cnut arrived with a massive fleet, variously estimated at 160 to 200 ships, carrying an army of thousands of warriors. He had spent the intervening months in Denmark, securing his position there, gathering reinforcements from across Scandinavia and preparing for the decisive campaign. This time there would be no quick withdrawal. Cnut had come to conquer England permanently. Cnut landed in Wessex, the heartland of the English kingdom, and began devastating the countryside. His strategy was to destroy the economic base of English resistance, while demonstrating that Ethelred could not protect his people. Towns were burned, crops were destroyed, and anyone who resisted was killed. The terror tactics that had worked so well for his father were applied with even greater intensity. The English response was chaotic. Ethelred was ill, possibly already suffering from the sickness that would kill him the following year. Edric Streona was supposed to lead the army of Wessex against the invaders, but he proved unreliable. Edmund was in the north, building his own forces among the Anglo-Danish population. There was no unified command, no coherent strategy, no effective resistance. Edric's treachery reached its culmination late in 1015. He defected to Cnut, taking 40 ships and their crews with him. This was not just a military loss, but a political catastrophe. Edric was the most powerful nobleman in England, the ealdorman of Mercia, the king's son-in-law. His defection signalled to everyone that the English cause was lost, that the smart move was to join the winning side. Many other nobles followed Edric's example, submitting to Cnut and abandoning Ethelred. Edmund refused to submit. While others were defecting, he continued to build resistance in the north. He gathered forces from the Five Boroughs and beyond, creating an army loyal to himself rather than to his father. He was preparing for the fight of his life, the campaign that would earn him the name Ironside and make him a legend of English resistance. The stage was set for the climactic year of 1016, when Edmund and Cnut would face each other in a series of battles that would determine the fate of England. Sweyn Forkbeard had begun the conquest, but it was his son who would complete it. And standing in Cnut's way was Edmund, the last hope of Saxon England, the man who would not give up even when everyone around him was surrendering. To understand Edmund fully, we must understand his father. Ethelred the Unready is one of the most criticised kings in English history, a ruler whose very nickname has become synonymous with failure. Yet he reigned for 38 years, longer than almost any other English king before or since. His reign saw both catastrophic defeats and occasional successes. His failures were real, but they were also the product of circumstances that would have challenged any ruler. Examining Ethelred's reign helps us understand the world Edmund inherited and the mistakes he was determined not to repeat. Ethelred came to the throne in 978 following the murder of his half-brother Edward at Corfe Castle. He was probably about 12 years old, too young to have been personally responsible for the killing, but forever tainted by association with it. His mother Ælfthryth was widely believed to have arranged the murder, and this suspicion cast a shadow over the new reign from its very beginning. Ethelred would spend his entire kingship trying to escape the consequences of how he had come to power. The early years of Ethelred's reign were dominated by his mother and by the nobles who had supported his accession. The young king had little real power, serving more as a figurehead while others made decisions in his name. This was not unusual for a child king, but it established patterns that would persist even after Ethelred reached adulthood. He never seems to have developed the confidence and authority that a successful king needed. He remained dependent on advisors throughout his life, and his choice of advisors was often poor. The renewal of Viking attacks in the 980s presented Ethelred with his first great challenge. His response established the pattern that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than organizing effective military resistance, he chose to pay the attackers to go away. The first Danegeld was paid in 991, following the English defeat at Malden. It would not be the last. Over the following 2 decades, payments to the Vikings would total hundreds of thousands of pounds of silver, an almost inconceivable sum that represented the accumulated wealth of generations. The policy of paying Danegeld has been harshly criticised by historians, and with good reason. It did not buy lasting peace, only temporary respites. Each payment demonstrated English weakness and encouraged further attacks. The Vikings learned that England would pay rather than fight, making raids increasingly attractive. The policy was self-defeating, creating the very conditions that made future payments necessary. Yet we should not be too quick to condemn Ethelred for choosing this path. The military situation he faced was genuinely difficult. The Viking forces of the late 10th and early 11th centuries were formidable, professional armies led by experienced commanders. The English fyrd, by contrast, was a part-time militia of farmers and craftsmen, poorly trained and difficult to keep in the field for extended periods. The defensive system created by Alfred the Great had been allowed to decay. Ethelred inherited a military establishment that was not well suited to meet the threat it faced. Moreover, paying tribute to avoid war was not unprecedented or necessarily dishonourable. Alfred the Great himself had paid the Vikings to secure peace at various points in his reign. Other European rulers regularly paid tribute to avoid conflict with enemies they could not defeat. The problem with Ethelred's payments was not that he made them, but that he made them repeatedly, without using the time they bought to improve his military position. He paid for peace but did not prepare for war. Ethelred's government was plagued by faction and distrust. The king seemed unable to maintain consistent relationships with his nobles. Advisors rose and fell with bewildering frequency. Accusations of treachery, some justified and some not, poisoned the political atmosphere. The king himself was suspected of arranging the murders of rivals and critics. Whether these suspicions were accurate, the fact that they were so widespread indicates a fundamental breakdown of trust between the king and his leading subjects. The St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002 exemplified the worst aspects of Ethelred's rule. Ordering the killing of Danes living in England was both morally reprehensible and strategically foolish. It did not weaken the Viking threat but intensified it, giving Sweyn Forkbeard a personal grievance to add to his political ambitions. It alienated the Anglo-Danish population of eastern England, whose support would be crucial in any defence against invasion, and it demonstrated a capacity for ruthless violence that did nothing to enhance Ethelred's reputation for justice and good governance. The massacre also revealed Ethelred's tendency toward dramatic gestures that created more problems than they solved. Rather than addressing the Viking threat through patient military preparation, he lashed out with an act of mass violence that accomplished nothing strategically while creating new enemies. This pattern of ineffective dramatic action would recur throughout his reign, as Ethelred repeatedly chose showy responses over effective ones. Ethelred's marriage to Emma of Normandy in 1002 was intended to address a strategic problem. The Normans had been providing bases and support for Viking raiders, and the marriage was supposed to end this practice by creating a family alliance between England and Normandy. In this narrow sense, the marriage succeeded, but it also created new complications, introducing a rival line of succession and connecting the English crown to Norman interests that would eventually prove disastrous. Emma herself was a formidable figure who would outlive 2 husbands and see 2 of her sons become kings of England. Her marriage to Ethelred produced 2 sons, Alfred and Edward, who represented a potential alternative to the sons of Ethelred's first marriage. The dynamics between these 2 groups of half-brothers would shape English politics for decades. Edmund and his brothers from the first marriage were older and had stronger claims based on seniority, but Emma's sons had powerful Norman connections and a mother who was skilled at political manipulation. The military failures of Ethelred's reign were numerous and consistent. English armies repeatedly failed to bring the Vikings to battle or to defeat them when battle was joined. The king himself seems to have avoided personal participation in military campaigns, delegating command to nobles who often proved incompetent or treacherous. The contrast with earlier kings like Alfred, who had personally led his warriors through the darkest days of Viking invasion, could not have been more stark. A king was expected to be a war leader, to share the dangers of battle with his men, to inspire them through personal example. Ethelred failed this fundamental test of medieval kingship. The campaigns against the Vikings followed a depressing pattern. An army would be raised, often with great effort and expense. It would march toward the enemy, sometimes coming close to bringing them to battle. Then something would go wrong. The Vikings would slip away before the English could engage them. Or the English commanders would disagree among themselves and fail to coordinate their actions. Or treachery would undermine the campaign from within. Time after time, the English effort would collapse without achieving anything, and the Vikings would continue their devastation unchecked. The chroniclers of the time recorded these failures with mounting frustration. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary source for this period, repeatedly notes that English armies were raised but accomplished nothing. The entries for these years read like a catalogue of missed opportunities and inexplicable failures. The chronicler's tone shifts from hopeful to resigned to bitter as the years pass, and the pattern continues unchanged. One particularly telling incident occurred in 1003. Ealdorman Elfric of Hampshire was supposed to lead an army against a Viking force, but he feigned illness at the critical moment, allowing the enemy to escape. The chronicle states bluntly that Aelfric was up to his old tricks, and that he began to retch and vomit, and said he was ill. This was not the first time Aelfric had failed at a crucial moment, and his continued presence in positions of command illustrated the dysfunction of Ethelred's government. A competent king would have removed such a man after his first failure. Ethelred kept him in place, ensuring future failures. The problem was not simply bad luck or individual incompetence. It was systemic. Ethelred's government lacked the ability to coordinate military efforts effectively. Different ealdormen commanded the forces of their own regions, but there was no unified command structure to bring these regional forces together. The king himself did not provide the leadership that might have overcome these divisions, and the nobles who should have been cooperating in defence of the kingdom were often more concerned with their own rivalries and ambitions than with the common threat. Edric Striona exemplified the problems of Ethelred's reign. His rise to power was rapid and suspicious. He became Ealdman of Mercia in 1007, replacing the previous holder of that office under circumstances that were never fully explained. He married Ethelred's daughter Edgith, cementing his position at court. He accumulated lands and wealth at a remarkable rate, earning his nickname the Grasper or the Acquisitor, and he was widely suspected of treachery, of arranging the deaths of rivals, and of putting his own interests ahead of the kingdom's welfare. The relationship between Ethelred and Edric was close but troubled. The king seems to have relied heavily on Edric's advice, often to the exclusion of other counsellors. This reliance gave Edric enormous influence over royal policy, but Edric's advice was not always good, and his motives were not always pure. He used his position to advance his own interests, to destroy his enemies, and to accumulate power. The king either could not see what Edric was doing, or did not care. The murder of Sigurfurth and Morcar in 1015 illustrated Edric's methods. These two Thegns were prominent leaders of the Anglo-Danish community in the 5 boroughs. They came to a royal council at Oxford, presumably under some form of safe conduct. Edric had them killed, apparently with Ethelred's approval. Their lands were confiscated, their families persecuted, and their followers left leaderless. It was an act of political murder that served Edric's interests while weakening the kingdom's ability to resist invasion. Edmund's response to this murder marked his open break with his father's government. By marrying Sigurfurth's widow and claiming the dead men's lands, Edmund was directly defying Ethelred and Edric. He was positioning himself as a protector of those whom the king's government had victimised. He was building an alternative power base that did not depend on his father's favour. It was a bold move, risky but necessary, if Edmund was to have any chance of saving the kingdom his father was losing. The contrast between father and son could not have been sharper. Ethelred relied on treacherous advisers, avoided military confrontation, and pursued policies that consistently failed. Edmund built his own following, prepared for battle, and showed a determination to fight that his father had never demonstrated. The son was everything the father was not, and this difference would shape the final crisis of the reign. Ethelred's health began to fail in 1015 or early 1016. The sources do not specify what illness afflicted him, but it was clearly serious and ultimately fatal. As the king weakened, the government became even more dysfunctional. Decisions were delayed or not made at all. The response to Cnut's invasion was chaotic and ineffective. The kingdom drifted toward disaster while its king lay dying. The final months of Ethelred's reign were a period of confusion and collapse. Cnut's army was devastating Wessex. Edric Striona had defected to the enemy. Many other nobles were following his example, submitting to Cnut rather than continuing a seemingly hopeless resistance. Edmund was in the north, building his own army and preparing to fight regardless of what his father did. The kingdom was falling apart, and Ethelred could do nothing to stop it. Ethelred died in London on April 23rd, 1016. He had reigned for 38 years, longer than almost any English king before him. Yet his reign was judged a failure by his contemporaries, and has been judged a failure by historians ever since. He left his kingdom in crisis, invaded by a foreign enemy, divided by faction, and demoralised by decades of defeat. The mess he left behind would fall to his son to clean up. The assessment of Ethelred's reign must acknowledge both his failures and the difficulties he faced. The Viking threat of his time was genuinely formidable, more dangerous than anything England had confronted since Alfred's day. The military and administrative systems he inherited were not well suited to meet this threat, and the circumstances of his accession, the murder of his half-brother that brought him to the throne, cast a shadow over his entire reign. Yet these mitigating factors cannot excuse Ethelred's consistent failures of leadership. Other kings had faced difficult circumstances and overcome them. Alfred had confronted an even more desperate situation and had triumphed through courage, determination, and intelligent adaptation. Ethelred had none of these qualities. He was indecisive when decisiveness was needed, trusting when suspicion was warranted, and passive when action was required. His failures were not just bad luck, but the result of fundamental deficiencies in character and judgment. For Edmund, his father's reign provided a comprehensive education in how not to be a king. Every mistake Ethelred made, every failure of leadership, every misplaced trust taught Edmund what to avoid. The son would be everything the father was not. Where Ethelred paid tribute, Edmund would fight. Where Ethelred trusted treacherous advisers, Edmund would rely on his own judgment. Where Ethelred fled from danger, Edmund would stand and face it. The legacy of Ethelred's reign shaped Edmund's brief time as king. The problems Edmund inherited were the direct result of his father's failures. The enemies he faced had been emboldened by decades of English weakness. The nobles whose loyalty he needed had been demoralized by years of ineffective leadership. The kingdom he was trying to save had been damaged almost beyond repair by the policies of the previous reign. Yet Edmund did not despair. He took the broken pieces of his father's kingdom and tried to forge them into something that could resist. He gathered armies, fought battles, and demonstrated a capacity for leadership that England had not seen in a generation. If he ultimately failed to save the kingdom, it was not for lack of trying. The contrast with his father's passive acceptance of defeat could not have been more complete. As we move forward to examine Edmund's own actions, we carry with us an understanding of what he was reacting against. His father's reign was the negative example that shaped his own approach to kingship. Everything Edmund did can be understood, at least in part, as an attempt to be different from Ethelred, to succeed where his father had failed, to prove himself worthy of the lineage that his father had disgraced. The story of Ethelred the Unready is ultimately a tragedy, the story of a man who was not equal to the challenges he faced. But from this tragedy emerged something more heroic, the story of a son who refused to accept his father's failures as his own destiny. Edmund Ironside would write a different ending to the story, even if that ending was cut short by death. The contrast between father and son remains one of the most striking in English history, a study in the difference that individual character can make in times of crisis. The transformation of Edmund from a prince of the blood to a warrior leader was gradual but unmistakable. Through the dark years of his father's failing reign, Edmund was developing the skills, the reputation, and the following that would make him the last hope of Saxon England. His rise was not sudden or unexpected. It was the result of years of preparation, of building relationships, of demonstrating the qualities that men would follow into battle. The exact timeline of Edmund's emergence as a military figure is difficult to establish with precision. The sources for this period are limited, and they focus primarily on the Viking invasions rather than on the internal development of the English royal family. But we can piece together a general picture of how Edmund moved from obscurity to prominence, from one prince among several to the acknowledged leader of English resistance. Edmund's older brothers died during the years of Viking invasion, though the circumstances of their deaths are largely unknown. Athelstan, the eldest son of Ethelred's first marriage, was alive in 1014 but dead by 1016. The other brothers seem to have died earlier, perhaps in the fighting against the Vikings, perhaps from disease or accident. Whatever the causes, these deaths elevated Edmund's position within the royal family. By 1015, he was the senior surviving son of Ethelred's first marriage and a leading candidate for the succession. The significance of being from the first marriage should not be underestimated. Medieval succession was not governed by strict rules of primogeniture, as later periods would know. The choice of a new king involved consideration of age, capability, and support among the great nobles. But seniority mattered, and the sons of the first marriage had a stronger claim than the younger sons of the second marriage. Edmund's position as the eldest surviving son of the first wife gave him a legitimacy that his half-brothers Edward and Alfred could not match. Edmund's marriage to Ealdgyth in 1015 was a crucial moment in his rise to prominence. This was not a love match, but a political alliance designed to build Edmund's power base in the 5 boroughs. Ealdgyth was the widow of Sigurferth, one of the thanes murdered by Edric Striona. By marrying her, Edmund was making a statement. He was declaring himself the protector of those whom his father's government had victimised. He was positioning himself as an alternative to the failed policies of Ethelred and Edric. The marriage also gave Edmund access to the lands and followers of the murdered Thanes. Sigurferth and Morcar had been wealthy and influential men with extensive properties in the East Midlands. Their followers, left leaderless by the murders, now had a new lord to serve. Edmund absorbed these men into his own retinue, building the core of the army he would lead against Cnut. The 5 boroughs region, where Edmund built his power base, had a distinctive character. This area, comprising the towns of Lincoln, Stamford, Nottingham, Derby and Leicester, had been settled by Danes during the Viking invasions of the 9th century. The population was a mixture of English and Danish, with Danish customs and legal traditions prevailing in many areas. These people had maintained connections to Scandinavia even while living under English rule. They were potential allies for a Danish invader, but also potential allies for an English prince who treated them with respect. Edmund's approach to the Anglo-Danish population was markedly different from his father's. Where Ethelred had ordered massacres and allowed his favourites to murder Danish leaders, Edmund presented himself as a protector. He married a Danish widow. He claimed the lands of murdered Danish Thanes. He treated the Anglo-Danish population as subjects to be defended rather than enemies to be destroyed. This approach won him support that would prove crucial in the campaigns ahead. The army Edmund gathered in 1015 was not large by the standards of major medieval battles, but it was loyal and determined. These were men who had chosen to follow Edmund personally, who believed in his cause and trusted his leadership. They were the core around which a larger army could be built when the time came for major operations. They were also a statement of Edmund's independence from his father's failing government. Edmund's military reputation was built through action rather than words. The sources do not record the details of his early military experiences, but by 1016 he was clearly recognised as a capable war leader. This recognition did not come from nowhere. It must have been earned through participation in earlier campaigns, through demonstrations of courage and skill that impressed those who witnessed them. The nickname Ironside, which Edmund earned during the campaigns of 1016, reflected qualities that had been developing for years. The qualities that made Edmund an effective military leader can be inferred from his later actions. He was personally brave, willing to fight in the front ranks alongside his men. He was energetic, capable of rapid movement and sustained campaigning that exhausted his enemies. He was resilient, bouncing back from setbacks that would have discouraged lesser men. And he was inspiring, able to motivate his followers to fight even when the odds seemed hopeless. These qualities stood in sharp contrast to those of his father. Ethelred had avoided personal participation in military campaigns. He had been slow and indecisive in his responses to Viking attacks. He had given up when faced with setbacks, fleeing to Normandy rather than continuing to resist. Edmund was everything his father was not, and this contrast was not lost on contemporaries. Men who had despaired under Ethelred's leadership found new hope in his son. The relationship between Edmund and the other English leaders was complex. Some nobles supported him enthusiastically, seeing in him the strong leadership that England desperately needed. Others were more cautious, uncertain whether to commit to a prince who was openly defying his father. Still others remained loyal to Ethelred, or had already defected to Cnut. Edmund had to navigate these divisions while building his own power base. Ealdorman Uhtred of Northumbria was one of the most powerful nobles in England, ruling the vast territories north of the Humber. His support would be crucial for any attempt to resist Cnut's invasion. Edmund cultivated a relationship with Uhtred, and for a time the two men cooperated in military operations. But this alliance was fragile, and it would not survive the pressures of the coming crisis. The church was another important constituency that Edmund needed to win over. The bishops and abbots of England controlled significant resources and wielded considerable influence over public opinion. Their support could help legitimize Edmund's position and mobilize resistance to the pagan threat. Edmund seems to have maintained good relations with church leaders, presenting himself as a defender of a Christian England against heathen invaders. The preparations Edmund made in 1015 were not just military, but political. He was building a coalition, assembling the support he would need to claim the throne and defend the kingdom. This required diplomacy as well as warfare, persuasion as well as force. Edmund showed skill in both areas, demonstrating a political sophistication that complemented his military abilities. The break with his father was a calculated risk. By defying Ethelred openly, Edmund was gambling that his father would not or could not punish him effectively. He was betting that the crisis facing England was severe enough to justify his independent action, and he was positioning himself for the succession struggle that would follow Ethelred's death. These were bold moves, but the situation demanded boldness. Cautious adherence to his father's failed policies would have accomplished nothing. Edmund's defiance of Ethelred also served to distance him from his father's failures. By acting independently, by pursuing different policies, by building his own following, Edmund was establishing himself as a distinct political figure. When Ethelred died, Edmund would not be seen simply as his father's heir, but as a leader in his own right, with his own record and his own supporters. This distinction would prove important in the competition for the throne. The winter of 1015 to 1016 was a time of preparation and positioning. Cnut's army was in England, devastating Wessex and receiving submissions from nobles who saw no point in continued resistance. Ethelred was in London, sick and increasingly irrelevant. Edmund was in the north, gathering his forces and waiting for the moment to strike. The stage was being set for the climactic confrontation that would determine England's fate. Edmund's strategy during this period seems to have been to build strength in the north, while Cnut was occupied in the south. The 5 boroughs in Northumbria were far from Cnut's main area of operations. Edmund could consolidate his position there without immediately confronting the Danish army. When the time came for battle, he would have a secure base and a loyal army ready to fight. This strategy required patience, a quality that did not come naturally to Edmund. He was a man of action, eager to confront the enemy and prove himself in battle. But he understood that premature action could be fatal. He needed to be strong enough to have a chance of victory before he committed to battle. The waiting must have been difficult, but it was necessary. The news of Ethelred's death in April 1016 transformed the situation. Edmund was no longer a rebellious prince defying his father. He was a claimant to the throne, competing with Cnut for the right to rule England. The time for preparation was over. The time for action had arrived. Edmund would spend the remaining months of his life in almost continuous military campaigning, fighting battle after battle in a desperate attempt to save his kingdom. The rise of Edmund from prince to war leader was complete. The years of preparation, of building relationships, of developing military skills had brought him to this moment. Everything he had learned, everything he had become, would now be tested in the crucible of war. The warrior prince was about to become a warrior king, and his brief reign would be one of the most dramatic in English history. The year 1016 stands as one of the most dramatic in English history. In the space of 12 months, England would see the death of one king, the crowning of two others, 5 major battles, and a negotiated partition of the kingdom. It was a year of almost continuous warfare, of shifting fortunes, and of individual heroism against overwhelming odds. At the centre of this maelstrom stood Edmund Ironside, fighting with a determination that would make his name legendary. The year began with England in crisis. Cnut's army controlled much of Wessex and was receiving submissions from nobles across the south. Ethelred was dying in London, his government paralysed, and his authority collapsed. Edmund was in the north, building his forces but not yet ready for a major confrontation. The kingdom seemed on the verge of complete conquest by the Danish invader. Ethelred died on April 23, 1016, St. George's Day. His death was not unexpected, given his declining health, but it forced immediate decisions on everyone involved in the struggle for England. The nobles in London, the churchmen, the citizens all had to choose whom to support. The choice was between Edmund, the adult son of the dead king who had been actively resisting the invasion, and Cnut, the Danish prince who controlled much of the country and commanded a formidable army. The choice was not as simple as it might appear. Cnut had powerful arguments in his favour. His father, Sweyn, had conquered England in 1013 and had been accepted as king by most of the country. Cnut himself had been acclaimed by the Danish army as Sweyn's successor. Many English nobles had already submitted to him and would face his vengeance if they now changed sides. And Cnut's military position was strong, with a large army and control of much of the kingdom. Edmund's claim rested on different foundations. He was the son of the previous king, a member of the ancient royal House of Wessex that had ruled England for generations. He represented continuity with English traditions and English identity. He had not fled or submitted, but had actively resisted the invasion, and he offered hope that English independence could be preserved, that the kingdom would not become a province of a Scandinavian empire. The nobles and citizens of London chose Edmund. On the day after Ethelred's death, or very shortly thereafter, Edmund was acclaimed king by those present in the city. This was not a formal coronation with all the traditional ceremonies, but it was a valid election according to the customs of the time. Edmund was now King of England, at least in the eyes of those who had chosen him. But Edmund's kingdom was more aspiration than reality. He controlled London and had supporters scattered across the country, but Cnut controlled far more territory and had a larger army. The new king faced the immediate challenge of turning his election into actual power, of building an army capable of challenging Cnut, and of rallying the English people to continued resistance. Edmund moved with characteristic energy. Within days of his election, he was out of London and raising forces in Wessex. This was bold, even reckless, given that Cnut's army was operating in that region. But Edmund understood that he needed to demonstrate leadership, to show that he was willing to fight where his father had only talked. His presence in Wessex was a statement that the new reign would be different from the old. The response to Edmund's call to arms was disappointing. Many of the men who should have rallied to their new king failed to appear. Some had already submitted to Cnut and were unwilling to change sides. Others were intimidated by Cnut's military strength and preferred to wait and see who would win before committing themselves. Still others may have simply been exhausted by years of warfare and unwilling to continue fighting. The chroniclers record Edmund's frustration with this lukewarm response. He gathered what forces he could, but they were not enough for a decisive confrontation with Cnut. The new king found himself in a difficult position, nominally ruler of England, but actually controlling only a fraction of his kingdom. He needed more men, more resources, more support if he was to have any chance of success. Edmund's solution was to return to the north, to the region where he had built his power base before becoming king. The 5 boroughs and the territories beyond had provided him with loyal followers before. Perhaps they would provide more now that he was king, and in the north he might find allies among the nobles who had not yet submitted to Cnut. The journey north was itself an act of military significance. Edmund had to move through territory that was contested or hostile, avoiding Cnut's forces while gathering supporters along the way. His success in making this journey demonstrated his energy and his ability to operate in difficult circumstances. It also showed that Cnut did not yet have complete control of the country, that there were still areas where English resistance could find refuge. In the north, Edmund found the support he was seeking. The men of the 5 boroughs rallied to him as they had before. Ethelred of Northumbria, the powerful ealdorman of the north, joined forces with Edmund. Together, they commanded a substantial army, capable of challenging Cnut in open battle. The prospects for English resistance suddenly looked brighter. Edmund and Ethelred decided to take the offensive. Rather than waiting for Cnut to come to them, they would strike into territory that Cnut considered secure. They led their combined forces into the northwest Midlands, devastating the lands of those who had submitted to the Danish king. This was a strategic raid designed to demonstrate that submission to Cnut did not guarantee safety and to encourage others to join the English cause. The raid was successful in military terms. Edmund and Uhtred's forces caused significant damage and faced no effective opposition. But it had unintended consequences. Cnut responded not by pursuing Edmund, but by striking at Uhtred's undefended homeland. The Danish king led his army north into Northumbria, threatening everything Ethelred had left behind. Ethelred faced an impossible choice. He could stay with Edmund and continue the campaign, leaving his own lands and people to Cnut's mercy, or he could return to Northumbria and try to defend his earldom, abandoning Edmund and the cause of English resistance. It was the kind of dilemma that Cnut excelled at creating, forcing his enemies to choose between bad options. Ethelred chose to return to Northumbria. He submitted to Cnut, hoping to save his lands and his people through accommodation with the conqueror. It was an understandable decision, given the circumstances, but it was also a fatal one. Cnut accepted Uhtred's submission and then had him murdered, eliminating a potential rival and sending a message to others who might think of changing sides. The murder of Ethelred was a blow to Edmund's cause. It removed one of the most powerful English nobles from the struggle and demonstrated Cnut's ruthlessness. It also showed that submission to Cnut was no guarantee of safety, that the Danish king would kill even those who surrendered to him if he thought it served his interests. This lesson was not lost on others who were considering their options. Edmund was now on his own in the north, his ally dead and his army reduced. A lesser man might have despaired, might have sought terms with Cnut or fled abroad as his father had done. Edmund did neither. He returned to the south, to London, to continue the fight. His determination in the face of this setback was remarkable, and would characterise his entire brief reign. London remained loyal to Edmund, its walls providing a refuge that Cnut could not easily breach. The city's resistance was crucial to the English cause. As long as London held out, Edmund had a base from which to operate, a symbol of continued resistance, and a prize that Cnut had to capture if he wanted to complete his conquest. The citizens of London, whatever their private doubts, had committed themselves to Edmund's cause and would not easily abandon it. Cnut recognised the importance of London and moved to besiege it. His army surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and communications. His fleet controlled the Thames, preventing reinforcement by water. The siege of London became the central military event of the summer of 1016, a test of wills between the Danish king and the English capital. The siege was not a passive affair. Cnut's forces attempted to storm the walls on multiple occasions. They dug a channel to bypass London Bridge, which blocked their ships from moving upriver. They built fortifications to tighten their grip on the city. The defenders, for their part, made sorties against the besiegers, disrupted their operations, and maintained their defiance despite the hardships of siege. Edmund did not remain idle while London was besieged. He was constantly in motion, raising forces, fighting skirmishes, and looking for opportunities to relieve the city. His energy during this period was extraordinary. The chroniclers record campaign after campaign, battle after battle, as Edmund refused to accept defeat and continued to fight against the odds. The first major battle of Edmund's reign occurred at Penselwood in Somerset, probably in June 1016. Edmund had gathered an army in Wessex and brought it to confront a Danish force. The details of the battle are sparse, but the outcome was an English victory. Edmund had proven that he could beat the Danes in open battle, a feat that had eluded English commanders for years. The victory at Penselwood was followed by another at Shurston in Wiltshire. This battle was harder fought, lasting 2 days according to some accounts. The fighting was fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides. Edmund fought in the front ranks, inspiring his men through personal example. The battle ended inconclusively, with both armies withdrawing, but Edmund had again demonstrated his ability to stand against the Danish forces. These battles, while not decisive, had important effects on the campaign. They showed that English resistance was not hopeless, that the Danes could be fought and even beaten. They raised English morale after years of defeats and disappointments, and they established Edmund's personal reputation as a warrior, earning him the nickname Ironside that would follow him through history. The nickname Ironside reflected Edmund's physical courage and his seemingly inexhaustible endurance. He fought battle after battle without apparent fatigue. He recovered from setbacks that would have broken other men. He seemed made of iron, impervious to the discouragements and defeats that had paralysed his father. The name was a tribute from his followers, and perhaps from his enemies as well, recognition that Edmund was a different kind of opponent than the English had previously offered. After the Battle of Shurston, Edmund moved to relieve London. He gathered his forces and marched toward the besieged city, determined to break Cnut's grip on the English capital. The Danish king, learning of Edmund's approach, lifted the siege and moved to intercept him. The two armies would meet again in another of the series of battles that marked this extraordinary year. The Battle of Brentford, fought in late summer 1016, was another English victory. Edmund's forces crossed the Thames and attacked the Danish army, driving them back with heavy losses. The relief of London was accomplished, at least temporarily. The citizens who had held out through the long siege could celebrate their deliverance and the prowess of their king. But the victory at Brentford was marred by tragedy. Many English soldiers crossing the river in pursuit of the fleeing Danes were drowned when they outpaced the main army and found themselves trapped. The Thames claimed lives that Danish swords had spared. It was a reminder that war was dangerous even in victory, that success could turn to disaster in moments. Cnut was not defeated by these reverses. He still commanded a powerful army and controlled much of the country. He withdrew from London but did not leave England. Instead, he regrouped his forces and prepared for another round of campaigning. The war was far from over, and the decisive confrontation was yet to come. Edmund used the respite to strengthen his position. He gathered more forces, consolidated his control over the areas that supported him, and prepared for the next phase of the campaign. He also had to deal with the continuing problem of treachery within his own ranks. Edric Striona, who had defected to Cnut the previous year, now offered to return to English allegiance. The question of whether to accept Edric's return was difficult. Edric was a proven traitor who had abandoned the English cause at a critical moment. His defection had encouraged others to submit to Cnut and had significantly weakened English resistance. There was every reason to distrust him and to refuse his offer. But Edric also commanded significant resources. As Ealdorman of Mercia, he controlled the largest and most important of the English earldoms. His return would bring men and money to Edmund's cause. It would also signal that the tide was turning, that even those who had supported Cnut were now switching to Edmund. The practical arguments for accepting Edric were strong, even if the moral arguments against him were stronger. Edmund chose to accept Edric's return. It was a decision he would have cause to regret. But in the desperate circumstances of 1016, with the fate of England hanging in the balance, Edmund felt he could not afford to reject any source of support. He needed every man he could get for the battles ahead. The autumn of 1016 brought the climax of the campaign. Edmund had fought his way back from the desperate position he had inherited at his father's death. He had won battles, relieved London, and gathered a substantial army. But Cnut was still in England with a powerful force, and the war had to be decided one way or another. The two kings were moving toward a final confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom. The military campaigns of 1016 saw Edmund and Cnut locked in a struggle that would determine England's future. These two young men, both in their 20s, both capable and determined, fought a series of engagements that tested their armies and their leadership to the utmost. The battles they fought were among the most significant in English history, though they are less well known than later conflicts like Hastings or Agincourt. Cnut was a formidable opponent. He had grown up in the world of Viking warfare, trained from childhood in the arts of combat and command. He had accompanied his father Sweyn on the invasion of 1013 and had learned from that master of military and political strategy. He commanded an army of experienced warriors, men who had been fighting for years and who were loyal to the Danish royal house. And he had the resources of Denmark behind him, able to call on reinforcements and supplies from across the North Sea. The Danish army that Cnut led was a professional force in an age when most armies were amateur. These men were warriors by trade, not farmers who occasionally took up arms. They trained constantly, maintained their equipment to high standards, and followed leaders who had proven themselves in battle. The bonds between a Viking chief and his followers were personal and intense, forged through shared dangers and shared rewards. The tactics of Viking warfare had been refined over centuries of raiding and conquest. The shield wall was the basic formation, a line of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping to form a continuous barrier. From behind this wall, they would thrust with spears and swords, trying to break the enemy formation while maintaining their own cohesion. When one side's shield wall broke, the battle typically became a rout, with the victors cutting down the fleeing defeated. The English fought in similar fashion. The shield wall was not a uniquely Viking formation, but the standard infantry tactic of the age. English armies were organised around the same principles of mutual support and collective defence. The difference was in training and experience. Cnut's men were professionals who had spent their lives preparing for war. Many of Edmund's followers were part-time soldiers, farmers and craftsmen who fought when called, but spent most of their time in peaceful pursuits. This disparity in professionalism was partially offset by other factors. The English were fighting for their homes and families, a powerful motivation that mercenary armies could not match. They knew the terrain and could use local knowledge to their advantage. And they had in Edmund a leader who could inspire them to fight beyond their normal capabilities. Edmund's personal fighting style was aggressive and direct. He led from the front, placing himself in the thick of the combat where the danger was greatest. This was not mere bravado, but a calculated leadership technique. A king who fought alongside his men earned their respect and loyalty in ways that a distant commander never could. Edmund's willingness to share the risks of battle bound his followers to him with ties of personal devotion. The chroniclers describe Edmund's prowess in battle with evident admiration. He was said to be a mighty warrior, capable of cutting down enemies with powerful blows of his sword. He seemed tireless, fighting through engagements that exhausted other men. His presence on the battlefield inspired his followers and dismayed his enemies. Writing more than a century after Edmund's death, the Anglo-Norman poet Geoffrey Gaimard described Edmund as bold as a leopard, a comparison that captured both his courage and his ferocity in combat. The epithet Ironside itself speaks to the impression Edmund made on his contemporaries. This was not a name he chose for himself, but one given to him by those who witnessed his fighting. His immediate successors were so impressed by his valour on the battlefield that they gave him this epithet by which he has been best remembered ever since. The name suggested not just physical toughness, but an unyielding determination, a refusal to break no matter what pressures were applied. Edmund was iron in his resolve as well as in his endurance. Historians have compared Edmund's struggle against the Danes in 1016 to Ethelred the Great's desperate campaigns in 871, and the comparison is apt. Both men faced seemingly overwhelming odds. Both refused to surrender when others might have given up. Both demonstrated that determined leadership could make a difference even in the darkest circumstances. The contrast with Ethelred's failures only made Edmund's achievements more impressive. Under competent leadership, the organs of English government worked well enough to raise army after army for the fight against Cnut. Edmund's success in repeatedly raising forces suggests that the English people had not lost the will to resist. They had lost confidence in Ethelred, not in themselves. When a leader appeared who was willing to fight, who shared their dangers and inspired their efforts, they responded. Edmund was probably a highly determined, skilled, and indeed inspiring leader of men. These qualities, combined with his personal courage, made him the natural leader of England's resistance. The campaign of 1016 saw Edmund and Cnut manoeuvring across southern England, each seeking advantage over the other. The Danish king had the larger army and controlled more territory, but Edmund had the initiative and the momentum. Each English victory, however incomplete, encouraged more men to join Edmund's cause. Each demonstration of Edmund's fighting ability undermined the assumption that Danish victory was inevitable. After the relief of London and the Battle of Brentford, both armies needed time to recover. The fighting had been intense, and casualties on both sides were significant. But neither king could afford a long pause. Cnut needed to complete his conquest before English resistance solidified further. Edmund needed to press his advantage while morale was high, and before Cnut could bring in reinforcements from Denmark. The next phase of the campaign saw Edmund pursuing Cnut into Kent. The Danish army had withdrawn to the southeast, perhaps to maintain contact with their fleet and secure their line of retreat if necessary. Edmund followed, determined to bring Cnut to battle and win a decisive victory. The English king understood that partial victories were not enough. He needed to destroy Cnut's army or force him to leave England entirely. The pursuit through Kent demonstrated Edmund's energy and determination. He drove his army hard, covering ground rapidly and giving Cnut little time to rest or reorganise. The Danish king, for all his military skill, found himself on the defensive, reacting to Edmund's moves rather than dictating the course of the campaign. This reversal of roles was remarkable, given the relative positions of the two sides at the beginning of the year. The two armies clashed again at Otford in Kent. This battle, like those before it, resulted in an English victory. Cnut's forces were driven back, suffering significant casualties. the Danish king withdrew across the Thames into Essex, putting the river between himself and his relentless pursuer. Edmund had now won multiple engagements against the supposedly invincible Danish army. The string of English victories created a new dynamic in the war. Nobles who had submitted to Cnut began to reconsider their positions. If Edmund could actually win, if the Danish conquest could actually be reversed, then perhaps it was time to switch sides again. The calculations that had led men to submit to Cnut now led some of them to return to English allegiance. This was the context in which Edric Striona made his approach to Edmund. The treacherous ealdorman had been with Cnut since his defection in 1015, but now he saw the wind shifting. Edmund's victories suggested that the English cause might prevail after all. Edric, ever attentive to his own interests, decided that his future lay with Edmund rather than Cnut. Edmund's decision to accept Edric's return has been criticised by historians, and with good reason. Edric had proven himself untrustworthy. His defection to Cnut had been a major blow to English resistance. There was every reason to expect that he would betray Edmund as he had betrayed Ethelred. But Edmund was fighting for survival, and he needed every resource he could muster. The practical arguments for accepting Edric outweighed the moral arguments against him, at least in Edmund's judgment. The reconciliation between Edmund and Ardric brought significant forces to the English side. Edric commanded the resources of Mercia, the largest of the English earldoms. His followers, whatever their personal feelings about their lord's shifting loyalties, came with him to Edmund's army. The English force that would fight the final battle of the campaign was larger and stronger because of Edric's return. But the reconciliation also brought danger. Edric was now inside Edmund's councils, privy to English plans and strategies. If he chose to betray Edmund again, he would be perfectly positioned to do maximum damage. Edmund must have known this risk, must have watched Edric carefully for signs of treachery. But in the heat of the campaign, with battles to fight and decisions to make, constant vigilance was difficult to maintain. Cnut, meanwhile, was not idle. He had withdrawn into Essex, but he was gathering his strength for a counterstroke. Reinforcements arrived from Denmark, fresh warriors to replace those lost in the summer's fighting. The Danish king was preparing for a decisive battle, one that would settle the war once and for all. He chose his ground carefully, selecting a position that would give his army every advantage. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation of the campaign. Edmund had won battle after battle, but he had not yet destroyed Cnut's army or driven him from England. Cnut had suffered defeats, but he remained in the field with a powerful force. Both kings understood that the next battle would likely decide the war. Everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, would be determined by the outcome of this final engagement. Edmund gathered his forces for the decisive push. His army included men from across England, warriors who had rallied to his banner over the course of the campaign. It included the followers of Edric Striona, whose loyalty remained uncertain. It included the survivors of the summer's battles, veterans who had proven themselves against the Danes. And it included Edmund himself, the Iron King who had led from the front in every engagement. The English army crossed into Essex, seeking battle with Cnut. They found the Danish army waiting for them at a place called Assandun. The location of this battlefield has been debated by historians, with candidates in both Essex and Suffolk. What is certain is that it was here, at Assandun, that the fate of England would be decided. The battle that followed would be the bloodiest and most consequential of the entire campaign. The approach to Assandun was tense with anticipation. Both armies knew that this was the decisive moment. The warriors on both sides prepared themselves for combat, checking their weapons, tightening their armour, saying whatever prayers their faith demanded. The leaders gave what encouragement they could, reminding their men of what they were fighting for and what was at stake. Edmund's army was confident after its string of victories. The men had beaten the Danes before and believed they could do so again. Their king had proven himself a mighty warrior and an inspiring leader. They trusted him to lead them to victory once more. The morale of the English force was high, perhaps higher than it had been at any point in the long years of Viking invasion. Cnut's army was equally determined. These were professional warriors who had crossed the sea to conquer England. They had suffered setbacks, but they had not been broken. Their king was young but capable, a worthy successor to his father Sweyn. They believed in their cause and in their ability to prevail. The Danes would not be easily defeated, whatever Edmund's previous successes might suggest. The two armies drew up facing each other across the field of Assandun. The shield walls formed, the banners were raised, and the final battle of the campaign began. What followed would be remembered for generations, a clash of arms that determined the future of England and earned its place among the great battles of medieval history. The Battle of Assandun, fought on October 18th, 1016, was the decisive engagement of the war between Edmund and Cnut. It was a battle that would determine whether England remained an independent Saxon kingdom or became part of a Scandinavian empire. The stakes could not have been higher, and both sides fought with a desperation that reflected the magnitude of what was at stake. The morning of the battle dawned with both armies in position. The English had pursued Cnut into Essex, determined to bring him to battle and finish the war. The Danes had chosen their ground and were ready to receive the English attack. The field of Assandun, wherever exactly it was located, would witness one of the bloodiest days in English history. Edmund arranged his army in the traditional formation, a shield wall stretching across the battlefield. His best warriors held the centre, where the fighting would be fiercest. The flanks were anchored by contingents from different parts of England, each under its own leaders. Edric Striona commanded the Mercian forces on one wing, a position of responsibility that reflected his importance to the army despite his questionable loyalty. Cnut's army was similarly arranged. The Danish shield wall faced the English across a space that would soon be filled with the sounds of battle. The Viking warriors were experienced and confident, veterans of campaigns across Europe. They had faced English armies before and had usually prevailed. They expected to do so again. The battle began with the clash of the two shield walls. The warriors on both sides pushed forward, trying to break the enemy formation while maintaining their own cohesion. Spears thrust over the tops of shields, seeking gaps in armour and flesh. Swords rose and fell, their edges dulled by repeated impacts against shields and helmets. The noise was tremendous, a cacophony of shouting, screaming, and the crash of weapons on shields. Edmund fought in the thick of the combat, as was his custom. He was visible to his men, his presence inspiring them to greater efforts. The king's sword rose and fell, cutting down enemies who came within reach. His bodyguard fought around him, protecting their lord while adding their own strength to the English assault. The centre of the English line pushed forward, driving into the Danish formation. The fighting was fierce and prolonged. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage in the early stages of the battle. The shield walls held, bending but not breaking under the pressure. Men fell on both sides, their places taken by others who stepped forward to continue the fight. The ground became slippery with blood, making footing treacherous for the warriors who struggled across it. As the battle continued, the critical moment approached. The outcome would depend on which side broke first, which shield wall collapsed under the relentless pressure. Edmund's men were fighting well, holding their own against the Danish professionals. If they could maintain their cohesion, if they could keep pushing forward, victory might be within reach. Then disaster struck. Edric Striona, commanding the Mercian contingent on one wing of the English army, withdrew from the battle. He pulled his forces back, creating a gap in the English line that the Danes were quick to exploit. The reasons for Edric's withdrawal have been debated ever since. Some sources say he fled in cowardice. Others suggest he deliberately betrayed Edmund, switching sides in the middle of the battle. Whatever his motivation, the effect was catastrophic. The withdrawal of the Mercian forces exposed the flank of the English army. The Danes poured into the gap, attacking the English from the side while they were still engaged to the front. The English formation began to crumble under this double pressure. Men who had been fighting bravely found themselves surrounded, cut off from their comrades, fighting for survival rather than victory. The collapse spread along the English line. As one section broke, it exposed the sections next to it to flank attacks. The orderly shield wall dissolved into a chaotic mass of men fighting individually or in small groups. The Danes, sensing victory, pressed their advantage with renewed ferocity. The battle had turned decisively against the English. Edmund fought on even as his army disintegrated around him. He refused to flee, refused to accept defeat, continued to cut down enemies even as his followers fell. His personal courage in this desperate moment added to his legend, but it could not change the outcome of the battle. The English army was broken, and no amount of individual heroism could put it back together. The slaughter at Assandun was terrible. The chroniclers describe it as one of the bloodiest battles in English history, a day when the flower of English nobility was cut down. Among the dead were Ealdorman Godwine of Lindsey, Ealdorman Ulfketel of East Anglia, Ealdorman Elfric of Hampshire, and many other nobles and thegns. Bishop Eadnoth of Dorchester fell fighting alongside his countrymen. Abbot Wulfsige of Ramsey died on the field. The losses among the English leadership were devastating. Ulfketel of East Anglia deserves particular mention. He had been one of the few English leaders who consistently showed willingness to fight the Vikings throughout Ethelred's reign. The Danes themselves had nicknamed him Ulfketel Snilling, Ulfketel the Valiant, in recognition of his courage. His death at Assandun removed one of the last of the old generation of English warriors, a man who had been fighting the Vikings for decades. The death toll among the common soldiers was equally severe. Thousands of Englishmen fell at Assandun, their bodies covering the field where they had fought. The army that Edmund had built through months of campaigning was destroyed in a single afternoon. The victories of the summer were erased by this catastrophic defeat. Edmund himself survived the battle, though how he escaped the carnage is not recorded. Perhaps his bodyguard fought a path through the Danish lines. Perhaps the confusion of the rout provided an opportunity to slip away. Whatever the means, Edmund lived to fight another day, though the army he had led was gone. The aftermath of Assandun was grim for the English cause. The defeat had destroyed not just an army, but the hope that English resistance could succeed. The nobles who had rallied to Edmund were dead or scattered. The momentum that had built through the summer's victories was gone. Cnut was now clearly in the ascendant, his position stronger than it had been since the beginning of the campaign. Edric Striona's role in the defeat ensured his lasting infamy. Whether he fled from cowardice or betrayed Edmund deliberately, his withdrawal had caused the English defeat. The chroniclers condemned him in the strongest terms, and later generations would remember him as one of the great villains of English history. His name became synonymous with treachery, a byword for the kind of self-serving betrayal that could destroy kingdoms. The question of why Edric acted as he did has never been satisfactorily answered. If he was simply a coward, why had he not fled earlier in the campaign when the fighting was equally fierce? If he was deliberately betraying Edmund, what did he hope to gain? Cnut had already shown that he would kill those who submitted to him, as he had killed Uhtred of Northumbria. Edric must have known that his treachery would not necessarily be rewarded. Perhaps Edric calculated that Cnut would need him, that his knowledge of English affairs and his control of Mercia would make him too valuable to kill. Perhaps he simply panicked in the heat of battle and made a decision he later tried to justify as deliberate strategy. Perhaps he had been in secret communication with Cnut all along, his return to Edmund's side a ruse designed to position him for exactly this betrayal. The truth died with Edric, and we can only speculate about his motives. For Edmund, the defeat at Assandun was a crushing blow, but not the end. He had lost his army, but he had not lost his determination. He retreated westward toward Gloucestershire, gathering what forces he could along the way. The war was not over yet, even if the prospects for English victory had dimmed dramatically. Cnut pursued Edmund, but did not press for an immediate final confrontation. The Danish king had won a great victory, but his own army had suffered significant casualties. He needed time to consolidate his gains and to rest his warriors. He also may have recognised that Edmund, even in defeat, remained a formidable opponent. A cornered enemy fighting for survival could be dangerous, and Cnut was too shrewd to take unnecessary risks. The pursuit and retreat continued through the autumn landscape of England. Edmund moved west. Cnut followed at a distance. The two kings were like exhausted boxers, each having landed heavy blows, each wary of the other's remaining strength. The war that had raged across England for months was approaching its conclusion, but the form that conclusion would take remained uncertain. Edmund's situation after Assandun was desperate, but not hopeless. He still had supporters in various parts of England. He still commanded personal loyalty from those who had witnessed his courage and leadership. He still represented the legitimate English royal line, the heir of Alfred and Athelstan and Edgar. As long as he lived and remained free, the English cause was not entirely lost. The question was what to do next. Edmund could continue fighting, raising new armies and seeking new battles. But the losses at Assandun had been severe, and it was not clear that enough men remained willing to fight. He could flee abroad, as his father had done, preserving his life while abandoning his kingdom. But this would mean accepting defeat, something Edmund had never been willing to do. Or he could seek terms with Cnut, negotiating some kind of settlement that would end the war without complete surrender. The choice Edmund faced was agonizing. Everything in his character pushed him toward continued resistance. He had fought battle after battle, had refused to give up when others surrendered, had earned his nickname through his iron determination. To negotiate with Cnut, to accept anything less than complete victory, went against every instinct he possessed. But Edmund was also a realist. He could see that continued fighting might lead only to more defeats, more deaths, more suffering for the English people. The army that had been destroyed at Assandun could not be easily replaced. The nobles who had died there could not be brought back. The resources for continued resistance were running out. Sometimes wisdom required accepting what could not be changed. The decision to negotiate was probably the hardest Edmund ever made. It meant acknowledging that he could not win, that his best efforts had not been enough, that the Danish conquest could not be entirely reversed. For a man who had defined himself through resistance, this acknowledgement must have been bitter indeed. But Edmund made the decision, and in doing so, he showed a different kind of strength. It takes courage to fight, but it also takes courage to recognise when fighting is no longer the answer. Edmund's willingness to negotiate, to seek the best terms he could get rather than continuing a hopeless struggle, demonstrated a maturity and wisdom that complemented his martial valour. The negotiations that followed would result in one of the most remarkable agreements in English history. Edmund and Cnut would meet, would talk, and would reach a settlement that neither could have anticipated at the beginning of the year. The Battle of Assandun had decided the military contest, but the political settlement remained to be determined. And in that settlement, Edmund would achieve something that his battlefield defeats had seemed to make impossible. The negotiations between Edmund and Cnut took place in the aftermath of Assandun, when both kings recognised that the war had reached a point where continued fighting served neither side's interests. The meeting that resulted would produce one of the most unusual agreements in medieval history, a treaty that divided England between two kings who had been trying to kill each other just weeks before. The location chosen for the negotiations was Alney, a small island in the River Severn near Deerhurst in Gloucestershire. The choice of an island was significant. It provided neutral ground where neither king would have an advantage. It limited the number of people who could be present, reducing the risk of treachery or violence. And it created a symbolic space, separate from the mainland where the war had been fought, where peace could be discussed. The meeting at Alney has been embellished by later legend. Some accounts describe a personal combat between Edmund and Cnut, a duel that ended with mutual respect and a decision to divide the kingdom rather than continue fighting. These stories are almost certainly fictional, romantic additions to a more prosaic reality, but they reflect the drama of the moment and the impression that the two young kings made on their contemporaries. What actually happened at Alney was a negotiation between two exhausted adversaries. Edmund had lost the Battle of Assandun and much of his army. Cnut had won the battle, but had also suffered significant casualties and faced the prospect of continued resistance. Neither king was in a position to achieve complete victory without further costly fighting. A negotiated settlement offered both of them something they could not obtain through continued war. The terms of the Treaty of Alney divided England between the two kings. Edmund would retain Wessex, the ancient heartland of his family's power. This included the southern counties that had been the core of the English kingdom since Alfred's time. Cnut would receive everything north of the Thames, including Mercia, East Anglia and Northumbria. London, the great city that had held out against Cnut's siege, would go to the Danish king. The division was not equal in terms of territory or resources. Cnut received the larger share, reflecting his stronger military position after Assandun, but Edmund retained a substantial kingdom, one that could support him and his followers, and that might serve as a base for future expansion. The treaty was a compromise, giving each king something while denying either complete victory. The treaty also included provisions for the future. It was agreed that whichever king died first, the survivor would inherit the other's portion of England. This meant that the division was temporary, that England would eventually be reunited under a single ruler. The question was which ruler that would be. Edmund was young and healthy, with every prospect of a long life. Cnut was equally young and equally healthy. The succession provision was a gamble for both of them. The financial terms of the treaty required Edmund to pay Cnut's army. This was a significant burden, acknowledging the reality that Cnut's forces had won the military contest. The payment would come from the resources of Wessex, further straining a region that had already suffered greatly from the war. But it was the price of peace, and Edmund accepted it. The treaty also addressed the status of various nobles and their lands. Those who had supported Edmund would retain their positions in Wessex. Those who had supported Cnut would be secure in the northern territories. The complex web of loyalties and betrayals that had characterized the war would be frozen in place, at least temporarily. Men like Edric Striona, whose treachery had contributed to Edmund's defeat, would find places in the new order. The agreement at Alney was remarkable for several reasons. It acknowledged that neither side had achieved complete victory, a rare admission in medieval warfare. It created a formal division of a kingdom that had been united for nearly a century, and it established a mechanism for eventual reunification that avoided further bloodshed. The treaty was a pragmatic solution to an intractable problem, a recognition that compromise was preferable to continued destruction. Edmund's acceptance of the treaty has been viewed differently by different historians. Some see it as a realistic acknowledgement of military defeat, a wise decision to preserve what could be preserved rather than lose everything in continued fighting. Others see it as a betrayal of the English cause, a surrender that abandoned much of the kingdom to foreign rule. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Edmund had fought as hard as anyone could have fought. He had won battles, inspired his followers, and demonstrated that English resistance was possible. But he had also lost a decisive battle at Assandun, and he lacked the resources to continue the war indefinitely. The treaty gave him a kingdom, gave his followers security, and gave England a chance for eventual reunification. These were not negligible achievements, even if they fell short of the complete victory Edmund had sought. Cnut recognised that conquering England was only the first step. Ruling it would require the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of the English people. A negotiated settlement that left Edmund in power in Wessex might actually serve Cnut's long-term interests better than a complete conquest achieved through continued bloodshed. Edmund's acceptance of the treaty legitimised Cnut's position in a way that military victory alone could not. The treaty also reflected the exhaustion of both sides. The War of 1016 had been extraordinarily intense, with multiple major battles fought in the space of a few months. Both armies had suffered heavy casualties. Both kingdoms had been devastated by the fighting. The resources for continued war were running low on both sides. Peace, even an imperfect peace, was preferable to continued destruction. The ceremony at Alney included rituals of reconciliation. The two kings exchanged oaths, pledging to honour the terms of the treaty. They exchanged gifts, symbols of the new relationship between them. They may have exchanged the kiss of peace, the traditional gesture of reconciliation between former enemies. These rituals were not mere formalities, but important acts that bound the participants and their followers to the agreement. The witnesses to the treaty included the leading nobles of both sides. These men would be responsible for implementing the agreement and for ensuring that its terms were honoured. Their presence at Alney committed them to the peace, making them guarantors of the settlement. Any violation of the treaty would be a violation of their oaths, as well as the king's. The news of the treaty spread quickly across England. For people who had endured years of war and uncertainty, the peace was welcome, even if its terms were imperfect. The fighting was over, at least for now. The constant fear of Viking raids and English reprisals could be set aside. Life could return to something approaching normalcy. The division of England created by the treaty was unprecedented. The kingdom that Alfred's descendants had built, that Athelstan had united, that Edgar had ruled in peace and prosperity, was now split between a Saxon king and a Danish king. This was a dramatic reversal of the achievements of the previous century, a recognition that the Viking invasions had fundamentally altered the political landscape of Britain. Yet the division was also temporary by design. The succession provision ensured that England would eventually be reunited. The only question was under which dynasty that reunification would occur. If Edmund outlived Cnut, England would return to Saxon rule. If Cnut outlived Edmund, England would become part of a Scandinavian empire. The future of the kingdom depended on which young king would die first. Edmund returned to Wessex to take up his reduced kingdom. He had much to do. The war had devastated his territories, and reconstruction was urgently needed. His followers needed to be rewarded and reassured. The administration of the kingdom needed to be re-established, and he needed to prepare for whatever the future might bring, whether that was peaceful coexistence with Cnut or renewed conflict. The weeks following the Treaty of Alney were a time of adjustment and consolidation. Edmund worked to restore order in Wessex, to repair the damage of the war, and to build the foundations for a stable reign. He was still young, still energetic, still determined to make the best of the situation he faced. The treaty had been a setback, but it was not the end. There was still time to rebuild, to strengthen his position, and perhaps eventually to reclaim what had been lost. Cnut, meanwhile, was establishing his rule in the north. He had achieved most of what his father had sought, control of the greater part of England. He was now one of the most powerful rulers in northern Europe, king of Denmark and of most of England. His position was strong, but it was not yet secure. He needed to consolidate his gains, to win the loyalty of his new subjects, and to prepare for whatever challenges the future might bring. The two kings, so recently mortal enemies, now ruled side by side in an uneasy peace. The Treaty of Alney had ended the war, but it had not resolved the underlying conflict. England remained divided, its future uncertain, its fate dependent on the lifespans of two young men. The peace was real, but it was also fragile, a temporary arrangement that could be overturned by death or by renewed ambition. Edmund had reason for cautious optimism. He was young and healthy, with every prospect of a long reign. Time was on his side, or so it seemed. If he could maintain his kingdom, build his strength, and outlive Cnut, he might yet see England reunited under Saxon rule. The treaty that had seemed like a defeat might prove to be merely a pause, a breathing space before the final resolution of the conflict. But fate had other plans. The peace that Edmund had won at Alney would prove to be briefer than anyone expected. The future that seemed to stretch before him would be cut short in a matter of weeks. The Iron King who had survived so many battles would not survive the peace that followed them. Edmund Ironside died on November 30th, 1016, just 6 weeks after the Treaty of Alney. He was probably in his late 20s, in the prime of life, with every expectation of many years ahead of him. His death was sudden, unexpected, and deeply suspicious. It transformed the political situation in England overnight, handing Cnut the complete victory that the treaty had denied him. The circumstances of Edmund's death have been debated for 1,000 years. The sources offer different accounts, some attributing his death to illness, others to murder. The truth is probably beyond recovery, lost in the chaos and confusion of the time. But the various accounts deserve examination, for they reveal much about how Edmund was remembered, and how his death was understood by those who came after. The simplest explanation is that Edmund died of natural causes. Disease was a constant threat in the medieval world, and even young healthy men could be struck down without warning. The stress of the year's campaigning, the wounds he may have received in battle, the exhaustion of months of continuous warfare could all have weakened Edmund's constitution and made him vulnerable to illness. A fever, an infection, a sudden failure of some vital organ could have ended his life without any human agency being involved. This explanation has the virtue of simplicity, but it has always seemed inadequate to many observers. The timing of Edmund's death was too convenient for Cnut, too perfectly suited to the Danish king's interests. The succession provision of the Treaty of Alney meant that Cnut inherited all of England upon Edmund's death. What had been a divided kingdom became a united one under Danish rule. The coincidence seemed too great to be mere chance. The suspicion of murder arose almost immediately and has never entirely faded. Later chroniclers recorded various accounts of how Edmund was killed, each more lurid than the last. The most famous version involves an assassin hiding in the privy, striking Edmund from below while he was attending to nature's call. This story, while dramatic, is probably a later invention, designed to emphasize the treacherous and dishonourable nature of the killing. Other accounts name specific individuals as the murderers or as those who ordered the murder. Edric Striona appears in several versions, his reputation for treachery making him a natural suspect. Some sources claim that Edric arranged the killing to curry favour with Cnut, hoping to secure his position in the new order. Others suggest that Cnut himself ordered the murder, unwilling to wait for natural causes to give him what the treaty had promised. The involvement of Edric Streona in Edmund's death, if it occurred, would have been consistent with his character and his history. Edric had betrayed Edmund at Assandun, withdrawing his forces at the critical moment and causing the English defeat. He had a record of arranging the deaths of rivals and enemies. He had every reason to want Edmund dead, for Edmund surely would have sought revenge for Assandun if he had lived. Edric's guilt in Edmund's death is plausible, even if it cannot be proven. Cnut's involvement is more difficult to assess. The Danish king certainly benefited from Edmund's death, gaining the whole of England instead of just the northern portion. But Cnut was also a shrewd politician who understood the value of legitimacy. The Treaty of Alney had given him a legal claim to the succession. Murdering Edmund would have undermined that claim, making Cnut appear as a treacherous killer rather than a legitimate heir. The political costs of murder might have outweighed the benefits. On the other hand, Cnut showed himself capable of ruthless violence when he thought it necessary. He had murdered Uhtred of Northumbria after accepting his submission. He would later have Edric Streona killed, despite Edric's services to the Danish cause. Cnut was not squeamish about eliminating potential threats. If he believed that Edmund posed a danger to his position, he might well have arranged his death regardless of the political costs. The truth about Edmund's death will probably never be known with certainty. The evidence is too sparse, too contradictory, too coloured by later political agendas to support definitive conclusions. What we can say is that Edmund died young, died suddenly, and died at a moment that was extraordinarily convenient for his rival. Whether this was coincidence or conspiracy, the result was the same. England passed entirely into Danish hands. The immediate aftermath of Edmund's death saw Cnut move quickly to consolidate his position. He claimed the whole of England under the terms of the Treaty of Alney. The English nobles, whatever their private feelings, accepted this claim. There was no one left to lead resistance. Edmund's sons were young children, incapable of mounting a challenge. The other members of the royal family were dead, in exile, or willing to accommodate the new regime. Cnut's conquest was complete. Edmund was buried at Glastonbury Abbey, one of the most sacred sites in England. The abbey claimed connections to the earliest days of Christianity in Britain and housed the supposed tombs of King Arthur and other legendary figures. Edmund's burial there placed him in distinguished company and reflected his status as a king of England, however brief his reign had been. The choice of Glastonbury may also have reflected Edmund's own wishes or those of his family. The abbey was in Wessex, the heartland of Edmund's kingdom and the ancestral territory of his dynasty. Burying him there kept his remains among his own people, in the land he had fought to defend. It was a final statement of Edmund's identity as a Saxon king, even in death. The funeral would have been conducted with appropriate ceremony. The church would have offered prayers for Edmund's soul, commending him to God's mercy and asking for his salvation. The monks of Glastonbury would have sung the offices for the dead, their voices rising in the ancient chants that had accompanied so many departures from this world. Candles would have burned around the bier, their flickering light symbolising the hope of resurrection and eternal life. The nobles who attended the funeral faced an uncertain future. They had followed Edmund through the desperate campaigns of 1016, had fought beside him at Penselwood and Shurston and Brentford, had survived the disaster at Assandun. Now their king was dead, and they had to make their peace with the conqueror. Some would find places in Cnut's new order. Others would lose their lands and positions. A few would lose their lives as Cnut eliminated potential threats to his rule. Edmund's widow Ealdgyth was left in a precarious position. She had been married to Edmund for barely a year, a marriage that had been as much political alliance as personal union. Now she was a widow with young children, dependent on the goodwill of the man who'd been her husband's enemy. Her fate after Edmund's death is obscure. Lost in the chaos of the transition from Saxon to Danish rule, the children of Edmund's marriage were even more vulnerable. Edmund had at least two sons, Edward and Edmund, who were infants or very young children at the time of their father's death. These boys represented a potential threat to Cnut's rule, living symbols of the Saxon royal line who might someday become rallying points for resistance. Their very existence was dangerous in the new political order. Cnut's treatment of Edmund's sons has been the subject of much historical discussion. According to some accounts, Cnut sent the boys abroad, ostensibly for their own safety, but actually to remove them from England, where they might become focuses of opposition. The children were reportedly sent to Sweden and eventually made their way to Hungary, where they grew up far from their homeland. This exile, if it occurred as the sources describe, was a relatively merciful solution to the problem the boys represented. Cnut could have had them killed, eliminating the threat they posed permanently. Instead, he chose to remove them from England while allowing them to live. This decision may have reflected political calculation, a recognition that killing children would damage Cnut's reputation. It may also have reflected the terms of some agreement made with Edmund before his death, or with Edmund's supporters afterward. The fate of Edmund's sons would have long-term consequences for English history. Edward, the elder son, would eventually return to England and would father a daughter named Margaret, who would become Queen of Scotland. Through Margaret, Edmund Ironside's blood would flow into the Scottish royal line and eventually back into the English succession. The exile that seemed to end Edmund's dynasty actually preserved it, allowing his descendants to play important roles in later centuries. The immediate impact of Edmund's death was the completion of Cnut's conquest. England was now united under a Danish king, the first time a foreign ruler had controlled the entire country. The Saxon dynasty that had ruled since the time of Cerdic, that had produced Ethelred the Great and Athelstan and Edgar, was displaced. A new era in English history had begun. Cnut moved quickly to secure his position. He divided England into 4 great earldoms, placing trusted followers in charge of each. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, cementing his legitimacy and neutralising potential Norman opposition. He rewarded those who had supported him and punished those who had opposed him. The machinery of Danish rule was established with impressive efficiency. Among those punished was Edric Striona. Despite his services to Cnut, despite his betrayal of Edmund at Assandun, Edric did not long survive his former enemy. In 1017, Cnut had Edric executed, reportedly saying that he was killing a traitor who had betrayed his own king and could not be trusted. The man whose treachery had helped Cnut win England was himself destroyed by the king he had served. The execution of Edric was both justice and prudence. It was justice because Eadric had betrayed his own people, had caused the deaths of countless Englishmen through his treachery. It was prudence because a man who had betrayed one king might betray another. Cnut could not trust Edric, could never be certain that the treacherous ealdorman would not turn against him, as he had turned against Edmund. Eliminating Edric removed a potential threat, while also satisfying the desire for vengeance that many Englishmen must have felt. The death of Edric was welcomed by many who had suffered from his treachery. The chroniclers record his execution with evident satisfaction, seeing it as fitting punishment for his crimes. Later generations would remember Edric as one of the great villains of English history, a man whose name became synonymous with betrayal and self-serving treachery. His fate served as a warning to others who might be tempted to follow his example. Edmund's death at such a young age inevitably raises questions about what might have been. Had he lived? Had he been able to consolidate his rule in Wessex and eventually outlive Cnut, the history of England might have taken a very different course. The Danish conquest might have been reversed. The Saxon dynasty might have continued. The Norman conquest of 1066 might never have happened, or might have taken a different form. These counterfactual speculations are ultimately unanswerable, but they highlight the significance of Edmund's brief life. He was a pivot point in English history, a figure whose survival or death determined which of several possible futures would become reality. His death closed off one set of possibilities and opened another. The England that emerged from Cnut's reign was different from the England that might have emerged from Edmund's. The memory of Edmund Ironside did not fade with his death. He was remembered as a hero, a king who had fought against overwhelming odds and had nearly succeeded in saving his kingdom. His courage, his determination, his refusal to surrender became part of the national memory, inspiring later generations who faced their own challenges. The nickname Ironside preserved his reputation, a permanent reminder of the qualities that had made him remarkable. The monks of Glastonbury maintained Edmund's tomb and kept his memory alive. Pilgrims visited his grave, seeking the intercession of a king who had died defending Christian England against pagan invaders. Whether Edmund was ever formally recognised as a saint is unclear, but he was certainly venerated by those who remembered his struggle. His tomb became a site of remembrance, a place where the English could honour a king who had embodied their resistance to foreign conquest. The contrast between Edmund and his father Ethelred remained sharp in historical memory. Where Ethelred had fled, Edmund had fought. Where Ethelred had paid tribute, Edmund had given battle. Where Ethelred had failed, Edmund had come achingly close to success. The comparison was unflattering to the father and flattering to the son, establishing a pattern that would persist through centuries of historical writing. Edmund's brief reign demonstrated what might have been possible under better leadership. The English people had not lost the capacity to resist. They had lost confidence in their king. When Edmund provided the leadership that Ethelred had failed to give, the English responded with courage and determination. The armies that Edmund led fought well, won battles and came close to driving the Danes from England. The failure was not in the people, but in the circumstances, in the accumulated damage of Ethelred's reign, in the treachery of men like Edric Streona. The lessons of Edmund's reign were not lost on later observers. Good leadership mattered. Personal courage in a king could inspire his followers to achievements they would not otherwise attempt. Treachery could undo the best efforts of the bravest warriors. These lessons were applicable beyond the specific circumstances of 1016, speaking to universal truths about leadership and loyalty and the fortunes of war. Edmund Ironside died young, but he died having earned his place in history. His 7 months as king were filled with more action, more drama, more significance than many reigns that lasted decades. He faced challenges that would have broken lesser men and met them with a courage that became legendary. If he ultimately failed, he failed gloriously, fighting to the last for a cause he believed in. The grave at Glastonbury marked the end of Edmund's earthly journey, but not the end of his story. That story would continue through his descendants, through the memory preserved by chroniclers and poets, through the inspiration he provided to later generations. Edmund Ironside was gone, but he was not forgotten. His iron determination had earned him immortality of a different kind, a permanent place in the memory of the English people.